Yeah. Yeah. Time you got on your phone? Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so I think we'll get started. Thank everyone for coming to this presentation. So my name is Patrick Newman, and I'll be talking about panics and depressions in early America. All right. So the basic gist about this presentation is we'll be talking about business cycles before the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve was founded in 1913. And since the financial crisis of 2008, you've had a lot of discussion about central bank monetary policy and just in general counter-cyclical policy, expansionary fiscal or monetary policy. And some of this debate or some of this discussion has centered around, can we survive without the Federal Reserve? Or just the country in general, can it survive without the central bank? There's been a lot of blame placed on central banks for causing the financial crisis and a weak recovery. And usually when those attacks are sort of levied against the central bank, the response is, well, we still have to have one. It's better than, the alternative, right? And because the alternative is almost always described as, well, before the Federal Reserve, as I'll explain, we had very severe business cycles. They were very frequent. And it was only when we had a central bank, this was the third central bank that we had, basically, that we were able to basically iron out those business cycles. So that's just sort of the general motivation. And what I'll be going through is sort of a brief overview of business cycles and panics in the 19th century. And then I'll be going through one case study in particular, the Panic of 1873, as well as the Depression of 1873 to 1879, okay, in depth. All right, so the ensuing depression. What makes this depression significant is that actually, according to modern recession dating, it's the longest recession on record. So the Great Depression, even though we all know it started in 1929, ended due to World War II, right? That's what we're taught here. Ended after World War II. The actual recession phase at the beginning was at least only the Great Contraction of 1929 to 1933. So this recession, or this depression, excuse me, actually beats it in terms of length, at least the way it's traditionally defined. Okay. So, the general myths that you hear about when you discuss life before the Fed was that America suffered from frequent and severe business cycles and banking crises. Okay, so you had these periodic business cycles. They reared their ugly head, and you had these very long, prolonged recessions. It took the depressions. It took a long time for the economy to recover, and then almost always intertwined with these recessions were these very harsh banking crises. So we discussed like a banking panic, and a panic just sounds awful. You have a panic, everyone's in pandemonium. They're trying to get money from fractional reserve bank. They don't have enough money. The banks have to close. The contagion spreads, et cetera. All right. And the way it's almost always described is to say, oh, these severe business cycles in these banking crises were due to the unregulated financial sector, supposedly, as well as general laissez-faire macroeconomic policy. So the idea is that, well, before we had government step in to sort of clean up the financial sector and the mess, you had all of these problems. And it's a very similar narrative to whenever you hear about the financial crisis, say, oh, well, before the financial crisis, the Federal Reserve and all sorts of regulators, they turned a blind eye, and you had all this deregulation, and you had this, commercial investment banks were allowed to join forces once again. Bernie Sanders sometimes rails against that, and then you had this whole, financial crisis, and then you had to have Dodd-Frank and all sorts of other stuff to really fix it up. This might come as a surprise. Lecture for me is you, but I'm going to argue that both are wrong. okay? In fact, it was the financial sector was too heavily regulated, and it was actually, in a sense, sometimes not laissez-faire macroeconomic policies. All right. And also, the business cycles were not nearly as frequent or severe as they have been commonly portrayed. Okay. At least modern research has shown this, though modern researchers still somewhat refuse to somewhat, grapple with this, the new data. So, we talk about business cycles and panics in the 19th century. Older analysts, both contemporaries, so someone in the 1870s, as I'll describe, as well as someone, let's say, in the 1950s or 1960s, looking back on the period, they relied on faulty economic data. Right. So one of the things that, if you take a macroeconomics course, there's statistics like GDP, unemployment, inflation, various production indices, and so on. Those haven't been around, forever. Basically, people had better things to do before they started to collect this data, particularly in the 1920s and the 1930s. So when you look back, in older periods, you have to use basically less reliable data, as well as contemporaries during those periods when they're trying to find some sort of measures of the economy. They might be saying, all right, let's look at the stock market, or let's look at prices. Consumer prices are falling. Wages are falling. Okay, that must mean that real wages or real prices, are falling. People are getting poorer. Or, the financial sector is contracting, et cetera. As we'll see, it was generally relying on faulty economic data, and they often confuse deflation with actual economic growth. All right. And so the NBER chronology, which is the National Bureau of Economic Research, they're basically the organization that is in charge of dating expansions and recessions in the American economy. They still sort of use this old, faulty data. They have not revised their business cycles from the past, even though much more improved data, statistical methods, et cetera, has come out recently that has actually shown that a lot of these, these depressions were not nearly as severe as we thought they were. So here, just a sample of some of the papers and the research that's come out, and notice that again, these are in mainstream professional journals, Journal of Economic History, Journal of Macroeconomics. If you don't have access to these articles, just a great place you can go is measuringworth.com. All right, so it's very easy to look at. It has a continuous GDP series. You look at things like real prices, wages, all sorts of things, even comparing it to different countries. It's a great website. And these sources really show that actually it's not as bad as we thought they were. All right, so there's the old saying, it's that a picture, is worth 1,000 words. And so, there we go. Okay, so I'll explain this. And there's another slide that will show it much more blown up. So the top part of the picture is the annual NBER recessions, sort of from expansion to recession. In the black bars, you can't really see the numbers at the bottom, but it starts at 1790 and it goes to 2000. And the teal right there, that is the 1870s that we'll be talking about. It's also down here. So those black bars represent recessions, right? So the Federal Reserve was created right around here. So just notice, looking at the old NBER data, look how many more recessions, how much more severe they were, et cetera, with now, right? So there's a lot less, the black bars are much less frequent, and they're also much thinner, okay? So that's the old NBER recessions, the dating. And when you look at it, you say, well, the evidence is pretty convincing then. At least it did seem like business cycles were much more severe. However, here is the alternative recessions dating created by Joseph Davis. He was one of the people on the PowerPoint slide before. He created a new continuous industrial production series from about 1790 to right before the Federal Reserve, and used it to basically date recession. So for how long did the economy contract, okay, before it started to recover. And just look at the enormous difference. Look, this whole, it looked like it was a giant depression, and now it's gone, right? And then you can even see elsewhere. So this has remained the same, but this has not, okay? It looks much different, right? And you can, in fact, so this is just the pre-Federal Reserve. It just shows it, a little bit bigger. You can see that, okay, again, in the 1870s, The NBER said it was from 1873 to 1879. Well, Joseph Davis, as well as we'll be talking about later, said that the Depression lasted from only 1873 to 1875. And there's many more examples, even the period around the 1820s. Again, that's just drastically gone. And sometimes there's entire periods that, okay, there's actually no overall macroeconomic recessions, et cetera. And then, just to at least go back briefly, this paper right here, The New History of Banking Panics in the United States, has done a similar thing. So from 1825 to 1929, right before the Great Depression, developed trying to study basically whether or not what was considered banking panics back then really qualifies what we called banking panics. And he found, this paper found, similar results. That were a lot of banking panics were not actually banking panics. Okay, so even banking panics and recessions were both less severe and less frequent than we thought. Okay, and this is now, instead of relying on older faulty economic data, basically relying on new methods, at least GDP series, et cetera, to show that this was not the case. All right, so we got that. And all right, so when we talk, at least now we'll go into a little bit more of the theory instead of just the data. This is Mises University, after all. We talk about business cycles. Hopefully I'm not surprising anyone here when I say business cycles and bank crises are due to government intervention. And of course, the general framework that we all know and love is Austrian business cycle theory. So what causes a depression, all right, or what's now called a recession, is we say, well, it's due to some sort of expansionary monetary policy from a central bank, okay, or from some other sort of government entity, right? That allows fractional reserve banks to engage in credit expansion. This artificially lowers interest rates, sets in motion an unsustainable boom, all right? Then if it continues, you're either going to have hyperinflation or you're going to have some sort of contractionary monetary policy, okay, either caused by the gold standard or something deliberate, put the brakes on the credit expansion, and then you have the bust, okay? And that, in general, that just naturally puts pressure on the banking system, okay? Why would it put pressure on the banking system? Well, as we know from Austrian business cycle theory, when the bust occurs, the unprofitability of the higher orders are revealed. So you have all these malinvestments. In these sectors of the economy, these industries have generally been borrowing money, so they can't pay back their loans. So that means banks now have to write off these loans, right? So they have to take a cut on their equity, and they can teeter more towards insolvency. So you could have a prominent bank that might fail, just in general from a business cycle, and that in turn could cause other banks to fail, could put pressure on the banking system, et cetera. However, in many cases, banks can be, at least in the free market, they can be quite resilient. What adds to this is, and it was particularly acute in the United States, and what's made these bank failures and bank panics so frequent, was that you had a whole plethora, basically, of government intervention on top of the expansionary monetary policy that basically made the banking system very fragile. Okay, so on one hand, you had various branch banking restrictions. Okay, so a branch banking restriction, basically, a bank could normally open up a branch across state lines, or even sometimes in another, in the existing state. Instead, and this is strategically lobbied for by banks, is that they blocked out competition from other states, or sometimes from other regions of a state. So instead of a branch banking system, which is what we have now, you can go to a Bank of America, not just in California, but also in New Jersey, Florida, et cetera. You often had a unit banking system, which basically meant that the banks were poorly diversified. They didn't make loans in other areas of the country. They generally stayed local. So, for example, if a crop harvest went bad, you had a lot of small banks that basically, they didn't diversify their loans, and they were really hurt by this. This made basically a bunch of very inefficient banks. Imagine if retail stores could not open chains across states. You'd have a lot of inefficient companies, basically. On top of this, you had various laws that incentivized banks to hold part of their fractional reserves in the form of deposits at other banks, okay? So as we'll be talking about, there was something known as the national banking system back in the day. where you had a system of country banks holding part of their reserves in reserve city banks, and these reserve city banks were holding part of their reserves in central reserve city banks. So you actually had, instead of each fractional reserve bank pyramiding credit on top of its own reserves, they were all pyramiding credit on top of sort of centralized reserves, somewhat similar to the Federal Reserve now. Okay, so what this meant is that if people in one region of the economy wanted to withdraw money from the banks, the pressure would spread to other regions, to other banks. Because if country banks are facing withdrawals, they're going to draw down on their reserves in the reserve city banks, excuse me, and then those banks are going to face pressure, and they're going to withdraw their reserves, and so on and so forth. Okay, and we'll talk about this. And then lastly, or at least this is not really the last restriction, it's just the one I talk about here, is that many banks were basically forced, if they wanted to issue notes, before the day the Federal Reserve issued actual handheld currency, banks used to issue banknotes. Then that meant that if they wanted to issue notes, they would have to invest some of their money in government bonds. And the idea was that, government bonds, if the bank fails, they'll be able to sell these creditworthy, these strong instruments. These are solid investments. They were not, particularly at the state level, in that many of these banks were fragile because of that. But if the public wanted to hold less deposits in more notes, many of the banks, they say, well, we have to buy more bonds. We can't buy any more bonds now. So you'll have to actually take our reserves right now in terms of our specie, such as gold and silver. And so that put pressure on the banking system, made them closer to becoming illiquid. All right. So all of these factors, and many of these were really unique to the United States, or at least they were unique in their in how often they were practiced, really made our banking system quite fragile. All right. So there were other banking systems that were not, pure free market systems, but they behaved much more efficiently during this time, during this time period. They still suffered from problems, but they were much, they performed much better, such as Scotland or Canada. Even though again they had problems, they were much better than the United States, and they suffered from far fewer banking crises. So basically, the general outline for a business cycle back in the pre-Federal Reserve era was you had some sort of expansionary monetary policy caused by the government. This creates the Austrian business cycle theory we all know and love. And then on top of a fragile banking system, this would cause a bank panic, okay? So if anyone's seen one of the old episodes of The Simpsons, I always love this episode where Mr. Burns, he's very sick and he goes to the doctor. He tries to check on his health, and the doctor basically explains that he has so many diseases that they're all blocked through the door. And if one of them were to get through, they would all basically be able to go through. And what Burns says is, that means what you're saying is I'm indestructible, right? And the doctor says, no, I'm saying even in fact a slight breeze. And then Mr. Burns just walks out of he's indestructible, basically. He just sort of walks out, it's like he cares about nothing. That was really the banking system, where all it would take is just one minor thing and the whole thing could come tumbling down. But people just said, everything would have to happen in a certain way. So, it's just never going to happen. And it would frequently happen. And, Mr. Burns just being like, indestructible kind of. And, that's just how I've always, that's how I've always imagined this as well. Okay, so I have actually done some of my earlier work. I've done a lot of work on American business cycles and banking regulations. I would tell you it's the least favorite part of my talk, but I would be lying. So here is some of my work on the Depression of the 1870s, which we'll be talking about, the Depression of the early 1920s, as well as the origins of the national banking system. So sort of going through the special interest motivation behind what actually caused the national banking system that later led to the Depression of 1873. So I'll be going through basically both of these right here. And I highly encourage you to read them. If you're up at night and you can't go to sleep, just print one of these out. It'll knock you out by page 3. So it's the tried and true method, I swear. So anyway, okay. So we go to, now we'll look at a case study in depth. So I've gone through saying, all right, the actual business cycles were not caused by laissez-faire. They were not nearly as severe or as frequent as we've all been told. So now let's actually look at one in depth. Okay, so to make to really prove to you I'm not lying. All right. So the general outline, I've said, of the 1870s business cycle was that in the early 1870s, you had a boom, particularly in railroads. So railroads was the new sort of transportation back then. It was a higher order, lengthening the production structure. Okay, it allowed people to travel distances much faster, but more importantly, goods and services linking the West to the East and so on. In this boom in railroads during this time period was primarily due to credit expansion following the national banking system. So as we'll talk about, the national banking system was created in the midst of the Civil War, some sort of massive government overhaul. As we all know, wartime crises always make for great opportunities for passing legislation, and that was true then, and it's true now, it was true then. And as we'll talk about, the system, much like the Federal Reserve, was due to special interest in private bankers. So for those who have read Murray Rothbard's work on the origins of the Federal Reserve, he sort of goes through how bankers trying to organize a cartel, they met at Jekyll Isle, and then they pushed through a bank bill through Congress, et cetera. This is, in a sense, fairly similar, okay, as we'll see. The Panic of 1873 was due to basically the inevitable slowdown in credit expansion combined with the fragile banking system. And then the both contemporary and as well as many present accounts say that, all right, it lasted until 1879, this very long 6-year depression. But in fact, as I'll show, there's really just a mild recession that lasted only until about 1875, okay? Then there was recovery. So the Panic of 1873 often ushers in something that's known as the Long Depression. So from 1873 to 1896, you say, oh, there was this terrible period of deflation and bankruptcies, and you're bringing the robber barons, you got inequality, and you got monopolies, and you got the whole stew, you got everything involved. Of course, that's not true. Basically, the Long Depression is really a myth. It was just deflation. There were banking crises punctuated during that, but it wasn't some continuous depression, okay? All right, so let's go into a little bit more in depth. Okay, so we're at the Civil War. So the year, it's no longer 1784, it's 1861. Remember it like it was yesterday. So 1861 to 1865, you had various Civil War interventions. So in late 1861, the United States, and bear in mind I'm concentrating on the Union here, the northern and western states, suspended specie payments. So there were various reasons. There was pressure on the banking system. The government was basically trying to borrow too much from them. So then the government and the banks suspended specie payments. So they were no longer, we were on a gold standard back then, but now they were no longer honoring their liabilities and converting them into gold and silver. Okay, so we were really on, as you could say, a fiat system, or more particularly, it was known as credit money, because they knew we would resume specie payments in the future. It actually took us nearly 20 years to do so. Then beginning in 1862, we started to print, the U.S. government started to actually print their own handheld paper money until about 1864, and they were known as greenbacks. And the green tint, that's where we actually get the, you think of the actual dollars you hold now in your wallets, it had that green came from the greenbacks of yore, all right? They were bigger size though, but that's a whole different story. All right, so then in 1863 and 1864, we'll go through the motivations behind this in more depth later, but you had the National Banking Acts. All right, so the United States, if for those of you who remember your American history, we, under Alexander Hamilton, we had a first Bank of the United States, or we had the Bank of the United States. Its charter got vetoed, charter didn't pass. Then we had the second Bank of the United States, and Andrew Jackson famously vetoed that bank. And so beginning at the Civil War, we did not have a central bank. All right, but now that during the wartime emergency, wartime crisis, we'd basically try again, and we'd push for a quasi-central banking system. All right, so we did get that, and we got the National Banking Acts, and this created federally chartered national banks. So instead of a system of state banking, you now had federal banking, where banks had to apply for charters from the federal government, and if they wanted to issue banknotes, which was, basically the lifeblood if you wanted to be a bank, they had to be backed by federal bonds, right? State banks could still exist, but it also just so happened that if you wanted to issue state banknotes, you had to pay a 10% annual tax on those, which basically totally removed, there are no state, banknote currency anymore. State banks still survive due to deposits, but that's a whole different thing. It also created a credit pyramid, that three-tiered structure that I spoke about before. You had country banks holding part of their reserves in reserve city banks. Then you had reserve city banks holding part of their reserves in central reserve city banks. And at the very beginning, the only central reserve city bank was the center of civilization on the earth, and that was New York City, at least in my opinion right there. So New York City basically acted, a lot of the banks in there acted as in a sense, central banks. You had the comptroller of the currency, which we still have today, and they had to institute capital and reserve requirements. And these capital requirements in particular, where you had to hold a certain amount of equity, made it very hard for smaller banks to operate. Okay, because if you have to meet a minimum amount of capital if you want to operate in a certain city or certain region, if you're a smaller bank, you don't have that, you basically have to go out of business. Okay, and then quite crucially, it basically perpetuated, in a sense, accentuated the unit banking system, all right, where it was hard for banks to branch. All right, where basically by the turn of the century, you had like 11,000 banks, but there was like less than 100 branches, okay, in terms of commercial banks. All right, so inefficient banking system. Okay, why is this? Oh, here we go. Oh, why that was there? All right, slight panic. Slight banking panic just hit me right there. All right, so we talk about the special interest behind this legislation. So you have an investment banker, Jay Cook, and Secretary of the Treasury, Solomon P. Chase. So Jay Cook is a prominent investment banker in Philadelphia. He was the forerunner. He was the country's most prominent banker until J.P. Morgan in the 1870s. So Jay Cook was located in Philadelphia. At that time, Philadelphia was a very prominent financial center of the country. So there was a various connection between Jay Cook and his brother, Henry Cook, and they lobbied to make Solomon Chase Treasury Secretary at the beginning of President Abraham Lincoln's term. All right, so they spent a lot of money beforehand in the 1850s elevating his candidacy. He was governor of Ohio and all sorts of other stuff. And then they basically lobby to make him Secretary of the Treasury. And then, what would you know, it just so happens that Chase was later impressed by Cook & Co.'s ability to sell government bonds, and he grants Cook & Co., the investment bank, the monopoly on selling bonds, okay? So selling federal bonds, the U.S. government, they had to sell their debt to basically prospective buyers, and Cook & Co. would basically, buy the debt, then sell it, and sort of pocket a commission, okay, from the government. So then Cook supports Chase's subsequent plan for a national banking system. And this was to, why would Cook do that? Well, if Chase's plan for a national banking system involved banks, if they want to issue banknotes, they have to buy federal bonds, right? Who are they going to buy federal bonds from? Well, it was these guys right there. So they realized, okay, this is a way of making basically my life easier. So that was one of the main reasons why they supported it. And you go through the record, and we'll sort of go through a quote. They really engage in a lot of newspaper propaganda. They talk to senators. They really try and persuade them, et cetera. And then, what do you know? Cook sets up his own national banks, including in New York City. So by 1870, Jay Cook had actually transformed himself from a relatively, you could say, renegade investment banker to really the most prominent banker in the country. And there was something known as the House of Cook, so much like you have the House of Morgan and so on. Later on, you'd have the House of Cook. So, for example, the Fourth National Bank of New York was really Cook's bank, and it just so happened to be the largest bank. It was the first largest bank in terms of assets, and then the second largest bank in terms of bankers' balances. So acting as that sort of quasi-central bank, that central reserve city bank. Okay, and then he had many other banks, et cetera. So he was, in a sense, he helped set up this system, and then he was directly profiting from it. Okay, so here's an interesting quote So this is part of the paper that I wrote. So this is February 12th, 1863. So this is right around when they're trying to lobby the national banking system. So Henry Cook writes to his brother. He says, "It'll be a great triumph, Jay, and one to which we have contributed more than any other living men. The bank bill had been repudiated by the House and was already sponsored in the Senate, and was thus virtually dead and buried when I induced Senator John Sherman to take hold of it, and when we went to work with the newspaper." So I have that bolded, so he goes, so I induced. All right, so like, how do you, like, all right, there's some sort of advantage there for Sherman. And then we went to work with the newspaper. So he's like, all right, we're going to spread the gospel of the national banking system. And then he says, "I'm very sure that Chase appreciates our efforts and knows, though he can never fully know, the value and efficiency of our services." And there's many other letters between them around this time period. They're basically saying like, hey, we were crucial in shepherding this bank bill through Congress and really getting everyone to support it due to the crisis of wartime emergency. And in fact, John Sherman, when he was talking about this bank bill in the Senate, he was saying, well, if we had a national banking system before 1861, there would have been no Civil War. Which is a little bit of a stretch, but, again, if he wants to argue for something, he's free to do so, I guess. Okay, in 1870 to 1873, after the Civil War, there was some slight contractionary monetary policy, and overall the money supply was roughly constant. Then from 1867 to about 1870, there was very limited credit expansion, which basically meant that the money supply was increasing by less than 3% yearly, which is not a lot. It's not perfect, but it's not a lot, okay? Then from 1870 to about 1873, there was much stronger credit expansion, and this was basically due to the national banking system maturing. Banks were slowly pyramiding their credit, and basically this is this crucial year, 1870, where enough of them did so. It was a lot easier for them to engage in credit expansion. And you just look at the jump, the money supply increased from about 3% yearly to about 10%. Okay, so a much significant increase in credit expansion. Okay, so this boom was created during after the national banking system. Took a couple years, but they got the job done. All right, in a sense, almost similar to the Federal Reserve. If we think about in 1913, it was created. Then it kind of couldn't work its magic, at least in terms of an Austrian business cycle theory, because of World War I. But then right after it did, and you had the Depression of 1920 to 21. Okay, so somewhat similar analysis here. All right, so now looking at some more statistics in particular, there are major malinvestments in railroads and sort of related higher order goods. Excuse me. So you had things like metals, fuels, machinery, and so on. All right, so we listen to Austrian business cycle theory. We say the lower interest rates increase the present value of long-term production processes in various higher orders the most. So businesses are going to be incentivized to embark on those. Okay. So we look at a money supply figure. So again, just notice the difference yearly, about 3% increase to then about 10%. Notice the pickup in GDP from about 3.2% annual growth to about 7.2%. The CPI, so we'll talk about that in a second. So wholesale price indices in the Joseph Davis production index shows the relative movements really explainable by Austrian business cycle theory. So we know Austrian business cycle theory is that the relative prices of the higher orders are increasing as compared to the lower orders. And on top of this, basically, the relative prices of the lower orders in consumer goods are increasing compared to they were to before. All right, so we know from sustainable growth that consumption declines. All right, prices of lower orders fall, and then the higher orders rise. So sort of that fulcrum. In this case, consumption is not declining. The public hasn't saved anymore. Instead, it's just credit. Okay, and you can see this at least for the CPI. So even though prices are still falling, there's still deflation. It's falling by less. Okay, so it signals that basically there isn't actually savings going on. At least this is one quick way of looking at it in the economy. And then you look at a production index for machinery. That's just one we'll look at. So in the paper, I have a whole list of basically comparing lower orders and higher orders, et cetera. You look at the jump from about 6% growth during this time period to 11%. And in this component, the major component of machinery was railroad locomotives. So this is really a proxy for railroads, okay? All right. So then you have the panic and recession. So by late 1872, 1873, there's the end of the boom. And then there started to be investor uncertainty. So there was a slowdown in credit expansion. All right, this led to a decrease in railroad profitability. This led to a decrease in the value of railroad bonds. And this led to an increase in the losses of banks, okay? So around this time period, the U.S. government were no longer in the Civil War. They're no longer running deficits. So J. Cook & Co., they don't need to sell as many government bonds. So what do? Well, they switched to selling railroad bonds, okay? So they were invested heavily. If you remember your three transcontinental railroads around this time period, you had the Union Pacific, the Central Pacific, and the Northern Pacific. J. Cook & Co., they decided to flex their muscles, get involved in selling Northern Pacific bonds. Just so happened that they had way too many of them. It was a huge loss for them. Again, so they were really hoisted by their own petard in a sense that they were, they had to fail because the banking system they helped create later caused a business cycle that ruined them, all right, particularly J. Cook. So the investment bank J. Cook & Co. fails in September 1873 and a panic begins, okay? So it was around September 20th. Stock market closed for 10 days, and cash payment was suspended until October 1873. All right, and what this actually does, this aggravated uncertainty. Sometimes you'll hear about how suspending specie payments allows banks to sort of shore up their, their balances and so on. But what it made it harder actually for people to buy goods and services because they couldn't get money from the banks, and it actually just led to, if banks are going to suspend, this bank's going to suspend, et cetera. And then the contagion sort of spread. And so you look at comparing 1870 to 1873. The money supply still actually increased because the government tried to print some greenbacks to shore up the situation, but it wasn't really successful. GDP drastically declined, where it didn't actually decline in absolute terms, but it was still, inching along, eking out an existence. The CPI fell, okay, so this is just from the decline in nominal spending, sort of the uncertainty that accompanies a business cycle. And then look at machinery, railroads fell off a cliff, where instead of rising 11% each year, they fell by nearly 18% in both years. So not just 18% in total, it's 18% each year of this, okay? So there's a huge decline, all right? So railroads, the classic higher order good that was hit hard. And what's important is if you actually look at the other series, the higher order goods were hit the hardest, and the lower orders not so much. Okay, so some of them actually increased. And this shows, this is the relative price movements. Not everything gets hit the hardest. Not everything gets hit, equally as bad. So like the housing sector was hurt much more than other sectors of the economy. Okay, that's sort of that structure of production analysis of Austrian business cycle theory. Okay. So then we go to the Long Depression, so 1875 to 1878. This sort of period, to quote the Long Depression. You can go to 1879, but in 1879, growth actually increased so significantly, regardless of what series you use. So just to be charitable, just look at 1878. So it makes it look like I'm not artificially trying to inflate my numbers. So when you actually look at the series, recovery began in 1875. Although prices continued to fall, and there was actually monetary contraction. So now enough banks fell, whereas we'll see that there were bank failures and the money supply declined. Okay, and there was laissez-faire counter-cyclical policy, which meant that there was basically no counter-cyclical policy, there was no expansionary monetary policy, and there was no expansionary fiscal policy. Now, what happened is you had this nominal illusion from deflation. So as I mentioned before, prices were falling, prices of stocks were falling, wages were falling, incomes were falling, profits, interest rates, et cetera. And this fooled contemporaries because people were only concentrating basically on their output prices. So they didn't realize input prices fell, or if they were a worker, they didn't realize that consumer prices fell. So if your income falls by 5% a year, right, you might say, oh, I'm getting 5% poorer. But if the prices of goods you buy also falls by 5% or even more, then you're actually better off. Okay, you can buy more goods now. Okay, but this is sort of harder to realize. Instead, the nominal illusion, so to speak, generally affects deflation because people like to see things go up, not go down, right? So took a historian, and this was even back in the 50s, and he admitted as much. He said contemporary appraisals of the intensity of the Depression tended to be the more alarming by their very vagueness and contributed to the prevailing pessimism. So everyone was just like, oh, we have this really bad Depression. As we'll see, they sort of had these faulty economic statistics. People didn't really know what was going on, so they just sort of exaggerated the problem, and this made it seem very bad. Okay, so if you look at just the example statistics, this organization estimated that New York unemployment in 1873 was 25%, right? Which is astronomical unemployment. The issue, though, is that they calculated in a way that we would totally find faulty, and that they just looked at the amount of people going to a relief organization each month. They said all of them were unemployed, like a charity relief organization, and they just added up each of them. So like if 10,000 people went in January, 10,000 people went in February, 12,000 people went in March, and so on, they had the total amount, then they divided it by the workforce in New York City, and they said that was the unemployment rate. Well, of course, what they don't realize is that they're assuming that each 10,000 people are completely new. Like if it's just the exact same 10,000 people, then the unemployment rate is not 10,000 plus 10,000 plus 10, it's just 10,000. Or whatever it is, okay? The Chronicle newspaper, prominent newspaper at the time, they said that the amount of people who were unemployed in the construction industry was actually, they said it was this large amount, and, what estimates later showed is that it was actually more than the total amount of people employed in construction, which is a little bit impossible, basically. That, they said more people are unemployed than even what existed in the construction industry. More people are unemployed in construction than in that industry, so it makes no sense. So there's no doubt that people were mad, and many workers in the railroad industries did have it very tough during this time period. But again, that was just due to the reallocation of resources from the railroad industry. But just in general, this was sort of part of the beginning of an enormous change. You had the development of large-scale farms, department stores, inequality, so the rise of these very rich entrepreneurs, et cetera, during the 1870s, and people are mad at that. And so they don't really know what they're mad at, they're just mad at it, and they're starting to channel their anger, and they say, well, it's the Depression, okay? So, when in doubt, you basically blame it on the Depression, okay? So again, looking at the 1870s, so the money supply each year declined by nearly 3% during this time period. But how then look at, okay, GDP was growing at less than 1% each year, and now it's growing at about 4% each year. So 4% GDP growth, remember, you hear now, obviously things are different, but, President Trump's like, oh, I can get to 3%, okay? So, well, we got to 4%, we weren't even trying, basically. The government wasn't even trying at this time period. And then this was actually fairly comparable to other, the overall average GDP or per capita GDP growth during this time period, in the 1800s. So prices continued to fall. There was some weak growth in railroads, but other industries caught up. And that's what Austrian business cycle theory basically teaches us. Right, you have to let these unprofitable industries continue to contract. If not, you're just sort of going to prolong the economic stagnation. And there was no economy-wide depression. Okay, then a sequel, sort of, if you want to go on, you say in 1879 we finally resumed specie payments. There was a large gold inflow that led to credit expansion and the Panic of 1884. Murray Rothbard, in his History of Money and Bank in the United States, talks about this briefly. So this is, again, just sort of the general kind of narrative of that. All right. So in conclusion, the severity and the frequency of business cycles and banking panics in the 19th century, they've been exaggerated due to faulty economic statistics. They were not due to laissez-faire but instead due to misguided government regulations, okay? So you frequently hear the narrative, it's that, oh, these business cycles, they were due to life without the Federal Reserve, and if only we had the Federal Reserve, everything would have been great. In fact, again, they were due to very many perverse banking regulations that made the banking system more fragile, as well as government monetary policy that made it susceptible to these periods of excessive credit expansion and then these busts. In the Panic of 1873 and the Depression of 1873 to 1874 is a classic example of this, so good case study, and you should tell all of your friends about it as well as my paper. All right, so thank you very much.
sign it, and I'm like, am I supposed to stand up and answer? I think I can give an answer, but it was a fun time.
The judge is a little intimidating. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. We're about ready to begin. My lecture this afternoon is entitled, "Is There Such a Thing as a Skyscraper Curse?" And I'd like to begin by handing out my new business card for the book that I wrote last year, The Skyscraper Curse. Just pass those around. I didn't realize how many people were going to be here today, so I might be running short of cards, but I have more of them in my office that would be available during office hours or some other time. I came to graduate school at Auburn University because I really liked the Austrian business cycle theory. I discovered it when I was an undergraduate. The economy was in a depression, and eventually I would read Murray Rothbard's great book, America's Great Depression, which I can highly recommend to everybody. It's still a great contribution amongst many of his contributions in so many different areas, as you've seen this week. Then I got to Auburn University. I'd met Roger Garrison, the Austrian macro theorist, who first told me about the Austrian business cycle theory. And so I thought, that's great, you know. And then I found out that the senior macro professor at Auburn University considered the Austrian business cycle theory a grisly embarrassment. And so that's when I decided to do my dissertation on prohibition, basically. And so I'd given that up. And then in 1999, I got a job as a macroeconomist at Columbus State University. And it was then that I discovered the skyscraper curse. It was published in an editorial in Investor's Business Daily. And basically what the writer was saying was that there was this association between the building of a world record-setting skyscraper and an economic crash. And that appeared in all the major business media of the day, and most of them just simply laughed it off as something they could write up for today's story. However, I saw the Austrian business cycle theory embedded in this skyscraper curse. So I began to study that association, and I finally was able to publish an academic paper on the subject in the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics, explaining this correlation between the skyscraper curse on the one hand and Austrian business cycle theory on the other. And then on August 7th, 2007, I wrote a blog post on Mises.org, quoting myself, There is a new economic record-setting skyscraper in the making in the United Arab Emirates. The skyscraper curse predicts economic depression and/or stock market collapses to occur prior to the completion of the skyscraper. So I've already explained what the skyscraper curse involves. Andrew Lawrence was the writer who first developed this association. He focused only on record-setting buildings. But basically, he described the curse as record setters are typically completed and opened during an economic crisis. And so this is not about normal business cycles. It's not about overall construction or investment statistics. But let's go back and examine the history of the curses. The first set of record-setting skyscrapers were the Singer Building. They used to make sewing machines, and the Metropolitan Life Building, which of course they sell insurance. Those were both started in 1906, and they were both completed roughly in 1908. The Panic of 1907, which was a significant event. It's not usually talked about very much, but it's the justification for the Federal Reserve Act and the founding of the Federal Reserve in 1913. So it was a big issue. Then the Woolworth Building was built and completed in 1913. But Andrew Lawrence thought there was no curse associated with this, so he considers the Woolworth Building to be a mistake. During the Great Depression, 40 Wall Street, which is now Trump Tower, the Chrysler Building, and the Empire State Building were all started prior to the stock market crash and all opened after the crash and the beginning of the America's Great Depression. 1973 crash and crisis, the World Trade Towers and the Sears Tower were begun before that, and both set new world records at over 100 stories. And this eventually resulted in a stock market crash, and the whole decade really from 1971 through 1982 was called the Great Stagflation. And as I mentioned, I was in college when there was a depression. That was 1980 through 1982. America had several months where the unemployment rate was greater than 10%, and where the inflation rate was over 10%. And interest rates were over 15%, if you can imagine that. And then at the turn of the century, we had an interesting situation here. The Asian financial crisis occurred in 1997, which was in line with the building of the Petronas Towers in Asia. And then we got the stock market bubble, and then Taipei 101 was constructed and opened in Taiwan. And the interesting thing about this particular cycle was that the bubble originated in Asia, and it was a technology bubble. And then when the financial crisis hit, which was really a currency crisis, the technology bubble transferred itself from the Asian tigers of Southeast Asia to Taiwan. Sorry about that. It was President Trump calling. I just can't take that call. And so the technology bubble that was in Asia was transferred both to Taiwan to the north and to the United States. And it was because of that currency crisis that occurred in 1997 in places like Vietnam and Thailand and so forth. And then we have the housing bubble and the financial crisis, which coincided with the building of a new world record-setting skyscraper in the Middle East, and it was called the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, setting a new world's record. The Kingdom Tower is yet another new record-setting skyscraper that's being built in the deserts of Saudi Arabia, and the construction has been delayed for quite some time, but that doesn't really matter too much in terms of the skyscraper curse itself. So skyscrapers and business cycles, this is where I went in and analyzed how in the world just building a single building could result in a severe business cycle. So I provided the links from the curse to the theory, and basically artificially low interest rates cause three different Cantillon effects, all of which, if you're reducing interest rates below the market level, all three of these effects will result in people wanting to build higher. And those are termed Cantillon effects after the first economic theorist, Richard Cantillon. Basically, he was the first person to describe economic theory in a very complete and comprehensive way. So lower interest rates causes land prices to increase. Does that make sense? It's something that everybody in real estate, for example, knows that's the case. As you lower interest rates, you lower the opportunity cost of land, and so the price of land increases. Now, what impact is that going to have? Well, if you lower interest rates and land prices go up, then any entrepreneur or any developer has to consider that to pay that higher price of land, you're going to have to build more space to rent. Okay, so, and we see this in Auburn today, with the last 10 years being basically near zero interest rates. The building of buildings in town has obviously gone up. If you look around town, you see the old buildings in downtown, they're typically 1 or 2 stories tall. But now the ones that are under construction are actually 6 or 7 stories high, and then 4 stories below are parking decks. So, and then there's one building that was built during the housing bubble. It's the large white building that's 5 stories, no underground parking, and it was built right before the housing bubble crashed and under similar circumstances. Lower interest rates increases the size of companies. This is something that you may not be familiar with, but it's something that people who work in industrial organization well understand. Okay, and the idea here is that with low interest rates, companies can engage in mergers where 2 companies combine to become a bigger company, acquisitions where a large company buys up smaller companies in order to become bigger. Under normal conditions, companies would grow just by growing their business. But with interest rates are low, those low interest rates, or the cost of acquiring companies or merging with companies, goes down, and so you'd see a different type of economic growth pattern as a result. And anytime interest rates are low, you see lots of mergers and acquisitions, which we've been doing the last few years, actually, along with general economic expansion. And the third, well, let me back up to the second one. If you have larger companies, you also have the demand for large amounts of office space in the central business district. Okay, if you think of a lot of mom and pops out there operating, you know, they do their own accounting and they do their own ordering. You know, everything is done by mom and pop, basically. But as companies in that particular industry get bigger and bigger and bigger, all of a sudden you need offices for accountants, you need offices for managers, for whoever's in charge of the company. You need a boardroom for the board. And so all of those features that mom and pop do in a business now have to be done by specialists working full-time on a particular area. So you have a marketing department, an HR department, and as a result, all of those people are going to be located in a corporate office building in a central business district. So, also lower interest rates result in Cantillon effects in the sense that they create new construction technologies and new building systems. Okay, so these are some more technical aspects of this process, but basically what you see is that you have to come up with new ways of constructing buildings. You have to come up with new ways of designing these buildings. You can see that in Auburn as well, the amount of technology and heavy equipment that's being used to build those taller buildings is nothing like what it would be if you were building a single-story building in the same place. So you have to come up with new ways of pumping concrete. Try to imagine the idea of pumping concrete up to the 100th floor of a building. Okay, it's hard to imagine how that could possibly be, but in essence, new technology has to be created. It has to be designed, it has to be created, it has to be manufactured in order to go higher. And every time you go higher, you create more building systems, and more building systems require taking up more space on every single floor. So if you think of the building systems, you're talking about staircases, elevators, escalators, you're talking about air conditioning, you're talking about plumbing, you're talking about electricity, internet cables, all of that. And every time you go up further, the air conditioning ducts have got to get bigger to pump the air higher. As you go higher, you need more elevator space in order to get people from the bottom to the top in a reasonable fashion. So you can't just do the same old thing. You've got to come up with new ways of doing things. A couple examples of that, a Japanese company came up with a whole new way of doing air conditioning and heating. Instead of big ductworks, which would have to be like 6 feet by 6 feet wide to pump enough air up to the 100th story, they've come up with a way where instead of, metal vents, they've come up with just a little teeny pipe that's 1 inch in diameter. And this pipe doesn't contain cold air or hot air. It contains a frigidant that takes heat or cold from one place in the building to another. So you're not pumping it, massive amounts of air. You're pumping up a small amount of refrigerant, and that refrigerant can actually go from one floor to the next, and it can actually go from one side of the building to the other. So if you've got one side of the building that's hot and one side of the building that's cold, it can actually move cold air from the cold side to cool off the hot side. And that's almost free heat, basically, or free air conditioning. So they had to come up with something entirely different. And you can imagine going from one floor up to 100 floors, how many elevators you'd need, and how much cable would be necessary in order to get that elevator from the bottom to the top and back again. Well, it turns out that the latest round of buildings in excess of 120 stories, a company in Europe came up with an idea that basically they had to. The steel cable that was going to be necessary to move those elevators was weighed 22,000 pounds. You get your mind around that. And so all of the energy that would be necessary to just pull the cable up and down would be enormous. And so this European company was tasked with coming up with a new cable, which they did, which could hold the same and pull the same elevator up 120 stories, but only weighed 2,000 pounds. Okay, so you had, scientists and researchers and engineers working to come up with that advanced technologies, things that we could do, but weren't necessarily efficient to do at the present time, but it was necessary to facilitate these record-setting buildings. And so they expended the resources in order to do that. So it's new construction technologies and new building systems. And this is the important point. Record-setting skyscrapers are merely an illustration of what is going on in the economy more broadly. So again, it's not that skyscrapers cause business cycles. That's very important. Most people have actually got that wrong, including some of my fellow economists and people in the media. I don't get any respect, basically. But hopefully you'll understand it. It's not that skyscrapers cause business cycles, it's just that skyscrapers are an illustration of what's going on in the economy more broadly. So yes, there's new advanced technologies for construction, there's new advanced technologies for building systems, but there's new technologies that are being developed in advance that are going on throughout the entire economy. But very often we can't see and identify and separate out all of those things. Okay, so for the housing bubble, because I had been well prepared doing this research on Richard Cantillon and the skyscraper curse and business cycles, I was able to spot the housing bubble for a variety of reasons, but one of them was the new record-setting skyscraper in the Middle East. But there were also other signs of exuberance in the American economy and stock markets being at record levels, and then, of course, housing prices being extremely high, and a lot of housing construction throughout the United States. So I started that with an article on Mises Daily, June 4th, 2004. Is the housing bubble popping or topping? August 8th, 2005. That's really when the top was, actually. Average housing prices in the United States basically topped out around this week, actually. And then I published or wrote The Economics of the Housing Bubble, and that was submitted in June, first week of June 2006. It wasn't actually ultimately published until 2009. And then on LouRockwell.com on 2007, that's Lou's title. I didn't put that title on there. I can't remember what my title was. But it really was, with the housing bubble, a lot of Austrians were very aware of the fact of what was going on. And so when we would, write an article or give a lecture in public, people were stunned. They couldn't believe it. They wanted to know what I'd been smoking. And, so there was widespread opposition to even saying there might be a housing bubble going on right now. The new record-setting skyscraper in the making, August 7th, 07, on the Mises blog regarding the skyscraper curse. And then another LouRockwell.com article, And then another article that was published in the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics. I think this would be something well worth you looking up, getting a copy, and reading, because what I do is I report on what the leaders of the Federal Reserve, the main body that sits in Washington, D.C., what they were saying to the general public in the year 2007. And basically, they thought everything was great in the economy. They told us that they were on the scene, they were ever vigilant, they were extremely powerful, and they had every bit of information you could possibly believe. One fellow from the University of Chicago, who was in charge of regulating financial markets, actually said that credit default swaps, mortgage-backed securities, and the like were a great new invention, that they caused liquidity in the markets, and they caused transparency in the markets. Those are two things that the Fed just loves to talk about, is transparency, which means they show you what they're doing, right? And liquidity means, well, the markets are very large and liquid, and so every little event is only going to have a small effect on the overall economy. And of course, those new financial instruments were precisely the reason why the liquidity in the market evaporated, and those things were the reason why we didn't have any transparency. None of us knew, really, that there was these trillions of dollars of new assets in the economy, where banks would take their loans, their mortgages, and package them into tranches, so that if you take, say 60% of them and say, this is rated, instead of being rated C or B, this tranche is now going to be rated triple A. And this other tranche will be the first mortgages that will go bad, and so we're going to rate this, unrated or very low rated financial assets. And so that was going on behind the scenes within the banks, within the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and all that. They were creating these products and telling us that, hey, the banks have got nothing but triple A rated stuff, when they actually had less, like triple C rated stuff. So when the Burj Khalifa Tower, renamed the Burj Dubai in honor of the Sheikh of Abu Dhabi, one person, well, that's the day that the building officially opened, January 8th, 2010, and CNN reports one person who wasn't surprised by the economic woes greeting the dedication of the tower was Auburn University economist Mark Thornton. He predicted tough times for the emirate 2 years ago in a blog titled New Record Skyscraper. So I finally got some respect there. Unfortunately, that wasn't going to last too long. I report on the recent literature, but that's really not terribly important for our purposes here today. It's just that a lot of other people have been writing on this phenomenon. Most notably, an economist in New Jersey named Jason Barr, and he is always statistically testing the idea that record-setting skyscrapers are a psychological phenomenon. It's just that, the builder gets it in his head that, why not just go 10 more stories and set a new record? So here's more papers by Barr and his co-authors. Okay, and in 2015, he published a paper with two of his co-authors, Skyscraper Height and the Business Cycle, Separating Myth from Reality. And then other papers, they find that, therefore, height does not predict cycles. They move together with temporary deviations due to builder competition, or the psychology of wanting to build the biggest building out there near peaks. Lucas's paper, which is incorporated into my book? Well, there is a general consensus in favor of the skyscraper curse. The idea that lower interest rates coincide with economic expansions, higher stock prices, and skyscraper construction. Some authors try to expand this analysis to other variables, but there still is a general consensus here regarding the skyscraper curse. Okay, that reporting on my paper, Loeffler's paper believes that optimism in the economy leads to this building. Barr believes that builder competition, social status, and ego are the reasons people build these record-setting skyscrapers. So this brings us to a very important methodological point. Austrians do not deny psychological factors, particularly in business cycles. But we expect to be able to explain why the psychology has changed. And Keynesians don't explain the change in psychology, they just say it's there, and then use that as a causal factor. Austrians use an economic variable, the interest rate, to show that those low interest rates make everything more profitable, at least temporarily. So everybody's making money, everybody's got a job, everybody's filling up their 401k, everybody's buying toys, boats, and all sorts of things. So yes, when artificially low interest rates goose the economy, people do become more optimistic and more speculative in their economic activities. And yes, I mean, once the crisis starts and everything goes bad, everybody's losing money, stock prices are going down, land prices are going down, people are losing their jobs, people are going bankrupt. It's not surprising that the psychology of people, the social mood, turns negative. So we don't deny psychological factors, we try to explain them, and the best way to explain social psychology is the interest rate. Okay, so Barr et al. 2015. Okay, he's referring to psychological factors such as builder competition, social status, and ego. So for two reasons, they say the skyscraper curse doesn't work. So one is that psychological factors played a role, and the other is date of announcements and date of opening of these record setters does not empirically fit the pattern of changes in GDP growth. Third, he actually showed empirically that skyscrapers do not curse, but that some third factor or factors causes both skyscrapers and curses. You know, it's hard to believe that he could write this paper if he had seen my paper, and he must have seen it. So I have to wonder about where he's coming from here. First of all, as I just mentioned, we don't deny psychology, we embed it in our Austrian business cycle theory. Second of all, neither Andrew Lawrence nor myself said that there's any precision with respect to announcement dates, construction start dates, opening dates, completion dates. There's a lot of dates surrounding these things, but there's nothing that you would expect to be causally related because, again, the skyscraper does not cause the business cycle. In fact, what it says at the bottom, skyscrapers do not curse, but some third factor or factors cause both. I wonder what that could have been. Again, he's written, many, many papers on the subject and is yet to see the light. So we tried to change his mind on that. Lucas and I wrote a comment for his paper in the same journal, and they didn't accept it. And it turns out he was one of the referees of the comment. Unbelievable. I feel like someday I'm going to turn in the mirror and see Rodney Dangerfield. Okay, so basically these are all the reasons why Barr's paper is wrong. He more or less proved the skyscraper curse by using this Granger causality test and some other econometric testing to show that skyscraper curse does not cause the business cycle. It's some other third factor. So on March 28, 2015, The Economist ran the following editorial, quote, "If, as the skyscraper curse suggests, the decision to build the biggest towers happens near the peak of the business cycle, then you could use record-breaking projects to predict the future path of GDP. However, the range of months between the announcement of the towers and the business cycle peak is large, varying from 0 to 45 months. And only 7 of the 14 opened during a downward phase of the business cycle. See the chart. In other words, you cannot accurately forecast a recession or financial panic by looking at either the announcement or the completion of the world's tallest buildings." And then this right here is the chart, which, basically shows that the skyscraper and the economic crisis in orange line up pretty darn good. Matter of fact, this crisis fits right in between the towers. These are the World Trade Towers and the Sears Tower, and then, of course, the oil shock in the beginning of the stagflation of the 1970s. And then you go back to the Great Depression, where they had the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building. There was another record as well here. Of course, it lines up with the beginning of the Great Depression. This is just the beginning of the Great Depression. The unemployment rate when the Empire State Building opened was 25%. And of course, it continued for the next 10 or so years. And then the panic of 1907 here lines up very well with the Singer Building, 186 meters in New York, opening in 1908. But also the Metropolitan Life Building also set a record at about the same time. So that's their proof that there is no skyscraper curse, which is hard to believe. Thank you very much. I'll take some questions. We've got about 5 minutes for questions. Any questions?
What was this article right here, the Economist? What was the title of that?
I don't know if I have the title, but I think it was a cover story item. And it came out in March 28th, 2015. Yes, sir.
So based on like any of the recent tallest towers, do you believe we're heading into another recession based on correlation?
Yes. Well, the tower that they're building in Saudi Arabia would set a new record at 1 kilometer tall, if you can believe that. They had to, originally they wanted to do it 1 mile tall, and the engineers said, no, that would just go through the crust of the earth or something like that. It was going to be so heavy. And that tower is set for completion in 2020. And so, yeah, I would guess that we should see the full signs of probably an economic crisis before that completion date. So roughly pretty close in time. Excuse me?
You obviously can combine this with other indicators,
Yes.
right? So would you say there are other indicators right now that may maybe combined with that biggest tower that's being built?
Well, yes.
Something's coming, right?
Yeah, the inversion of the yield curve is an important one. That shows that there's growing economic stress in the economy, and the bank lending has also popped up. So those are other indicators that sort of support it. Yes, you.
Okay. Does, I guess, the correlation necessarily require, like, the tallest building in the world? Or could it be, like, for a given, like, could you look at a given area, say, like, New York? Like, for instance, the spate of buildings that are proposed to go up in Midtown, they're supposed to be some of the tallest in Midtown.
Yes.
I think they're all slightly taller than One World Trade Center. But those are, like, being proposed right now. And then in Brooklyn, there's two buildings that are actually the tallest in Brooklyn. And those are being completed in 2020. So could you look at that as well?
Yeah, there's a chapter in my book where I look at other levels of skyscraper, so state levels. They don't match up nearly as well because individual states have specialized economies. So it happened in Arkansas, but Arkansas is an agricultural state, so agricultural things skewed it off. Michigan is a car building state, or used to be, and problems in the auto industry will also skew events in states like that. So it's, when you go to the whole world, then I guess it tends to be easier to get it right because it's the entire world economy, whereas smaller units like the continent of Europe, records there presaged the problem with the pig. Portugal, Italy, Iceland, Greece, and Spain. So yes, it can be applicable, it's just not as always as accurate.
It's sort of follow up on the previous question. What sort of factors skew the image here? For example, Singapore experienced a lot of deregulation and taxes and had a lot of record-breaking skyscrapers that weren't due to artificially low interest rates. What are some of the other factors that lead to very tall skyscrapers that aren't indicative of a recession?
Well, I mean, I think under normal conditions, or even under easy money conditions, you can get very tall buildings that don't necessarily break records. Like, for example, in China, before the financial crisis, they were building lots of many very tall skyscrapers, and they're, again, building many tall skyscrapers, just not record-setting. Somebody wanted to build a record-setting skyscraper in China, and the Communist Party stopped them. And Pravda, was it Pravda? No, not Pravda. The newspaper of the National Communist Party said, they said there's environmental concerns, and also they were concerned about the skyscraper curse. So at least they gave me some respect.
Does the housing bubble always go along with bubble in the stock market? Because when I researched about the housing bubble in China, I observed that with idle cash, when with low interest rates, from the consumer side, they usually tend to invest in the stock market, and only when there's a depression of the stock market, they change the stock market. But
To housing?
yeah, housing.
Yeah.
Change from, so but sometimes the database is show that two bubbles they go along with each other. So I don't know which ones.
Okay, it's about the relationship between stock markets and real estate markets, and booms and busts almost always involve some form of real estate, or maybe a combination of real estate. So it could be housing and commercial building, it can be commercial and industrial, but it always involves some new buildings of real estate, because those new industries have to be fit someplace, whether they're, whatever type of industry they are. So, yes, almost all bubbles that I'm aware of have involved real estate, and they do have the following general tendency. For example, in Japan, it was noteworthy that the stock market crashed in Japan in 1989, but the real estate market did not go negative for another 3 or 4 years. Real estate is somewhat considered to be a safer place for your investments. It provides tax relief and various other things, so people will sometimes switch from assets like stocks that they don't, seem to have as much tangible value or stable value, and they might move their money into real estate as a way of protecting it, but it usually doesn't work. Right there. You.
I apologize for hearing, so this might go in cover, I apologize.
Okay.
All right. So you said, and I'm quoting, record-setting skyscrapers are reflections of what is really going on with the economy. Is there like another real-life practical reflection of how the economy is going on? That's not a record-setting skyscraper, but that's practical enough for everyone to understand.
I'm sure there are. Things like stadium building, things like building, a company that may have their employees in a bunch of buildings in London, let's say, or New York, and then they decide to build a very large corporate building for everybody to be in. That kind of building, stadiums and corporate headquarters, is often related to the business cycle. And as a matter of fact, the second Cantillon effect, whereby businesses become bigger and they need more office space as a result, and they need it in the central business district, is part of the whole skyscraper thing. So there probably are a lot of those things. People have suggested a variety of other indicators that are somewhat related to the skyscraper curse. Okay, we're out of time. Thank you very much.
I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks very much for coming to this talk on environmental resource economics. My name is Timothy Terrell. I teach economics at Wofford College in Spartanburg, South Carolina. We're very happy to have made it to the NCAA tournament and made a good showing there last season. That's about all I know about basketball. But this is actually one of my favorite subjects. And when I teach I don't teach the environmental economics course at Wofford, but I do teach a course on regulation. So I use that as my kind of foot in the door to teach about this kind of thing when I get an opportunity. And it's an area that I focused on when I was in graduate school here at Auburn, because it's an area where I think that the perception is that there are some fairly serious problems for those who want to see free markets, but at the same time, what do we do about these kinds of problems like resource use, where there might be deforestation? What do we do about the common perception that we're going to run out of oil reserves, or that we're going to fish the oceans out, or what do we do about recycling? Those are issues that keep coming up in public discourse, and I think it's important for us to think through those things with a mind toward how we can integrate markets and the way human beings react to incentives. The other key area here that we'll have to cover is the externality issue, the spillover effects. Any activity that we conduct, whether it's consumption or production, is going to produce some kind of side effect. So that's everything from smoking cigarettes around bystanders to paper mills that generate a kind of an odor, fireworks, litter on the side of the road, water pollution. So all of these issues are ones that we're hearing about all the time, and it's helpful, I think, to give at least a quick rundown of some of the ways we can think about these more intelligently. The core issue for both of these is property rights. So whether we're talking about resource use and trying to avoid waste in the use of forests or underground oil resources or water, or whether we're trying to figure out a way to deal with an externality problem, a pollution problem, I think that we have to keep our eye on what's happening with property rights. This is an aerial photograph taken of the border region between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And you can fairly easily see the border there, even without some sort of fence or flag or anything to point that out, because it's very clearly deforested on the Haitian side of the border, and the Dominican Republic side is carpeted with greenery. Trees have not been cut down to the same extent on the Dominican Republic side. So if you look at the Economic Freedom Index, which the Fraser Institute puts out every year or two, I think, they rank each country according to how much economic freedom each country has. And we see that there's a pretty significant difference between these two countries with regard to their economic freedom. Haiti ranks number 103 in the most recent index, and the Dominican Republic ranks number 62. So even though the Dominican Republic is not as economically free as, say, the United States or Singapore or Hong Kong or something, we would still see a sizable difference between these two countries. And if we drill down into, the index looks at all kinds of things like police corruption and marginal tax rates and other kinds of things. If we look at the particular part of that index that deals with property rights and the protection of property rights, this is not a ranking, this is the actual score that the index creators attached to the protection of property rights in these two countries. And so Haiti had a rating of 2.79. The Dominican Republic had a rating of 4.82, much, much higher. Not as high as, of course, we would like to see, but the difference there is very clear, and you can see the impact of that, I think, on the forest cover in this area. So where we're going here, if we have enough time, and I've got a lot to cover here, is first a kind of a primer on subjectivity, efficiency, and the environment. So we're going to look at some principles for understanding environmental issues, government and environmental crisis. So We often see environmental crises that are kind of played up in the media as being the fault of greedy capitalists, and maybe we can think more carefully about that. Is this really a problem of capitalism that's just left free to deplete resources and destroy the planet? What role does the government play in these crises? We'll look at then energy, emissions, and growth, and I think that's an important place to stop here with this brief talk. So first, let's look at subjectivity, efficiency, and the environment. So there are a lot of allegations of market failure. If you take a basic economics class, a 101 or 201 level micro or macro course, you're probably going to hear about these market failures. One is that markets are alleged to either underproduce or overproduce goods and services that create externalities, these side effects that I mentioned earlier. Secondly, they are said to underproduce public goods. And people often confuse that term. They think that maybe a public good is just a good that's provided by the government. What we mean by public good in economic terminology is that a public good is one that is non-exclusive and non-rival. That is, you can't keep people from consuming it once it's produced. And if one person consumes it, there's just as much left over for someone else. And a classic example of that would be a lighthouse. Now, there are a lot of problems with the arguments that the mainstream makes on public goods and on externalities. I'm not going to go through all of this on public goods, but just for completeness, I want you to have this kind of list of allegations against the market here in your head. The third is that there may be some kind of inefficiency from market power, that monopolies might emerge that cause the price system to not work very well, and so the argument is that we need government to intervene to do some kind of antitrust. Again, I'll leave that to others to cover that. But the problems that we see with externalities and the problems that we might see with public goods provision really boil down to a property rights issue again. And I think that a lot of these allegations lose their force once we start to investigate where property rights fit into these situations. So you can argue that the market didn't meet some kind of ideal standard. You can argue that maybe markets didn't provide enough public goods, or maybe there's underproduction of some good that created a positive side effect on society. But even if you could do that, and I think there are enormous calculation problems with trying to do that, even if you could do that, I think you'd still have a long way to go to show that the government needed to intervene here. And you'd have to argue, secondly, that the government intervention would produce results that are superior. And I hope to show you here why that would be a very difficult case to make. I would argue that in many cases where government has intervened supposedly on behalf of the environment, we've actually seen worse results rather than better results. So there are three basic approaches to environmental problems. The mainstream favors typically either a tax subsidy scheme or a regulatory approach to solving environmental problems. So either the government's going to tax a side effect that they think is undesirable, or they're going to regulate it. So take fireworks, for example. I have a relative who had a motorboat parked in his backyard, and the neighbors set off fireworks. The fireworks landed on the boat cover, burned through, and destroyed the boat overnight. So we have an externality problem there, right? So if the government's trying to solve that kind of problem, they could either tax fireworks, or they could regulate fireworks or ban them or something. And that's typically how people tend to respond to these kinds of problems. They say, well, knee-jerk, the government ought to try to intervene to stop people from using fireworks so indiscriminately. A property rights approach is fundamentally different. And there are variations within this. There's a kind of a common law approach that you would see in Ronald Coase's work and Harry Dimsatz's work, and then you'd see a natural law approach which comes out of Rothbard and Walter Block, and I think that second approach is really the way to go, and we'll talk about some of the key literature there. Rory Cardado points out that efficiency, if we're trying to get an efficient outcome, we have a fundamental problem. First of all, it's an individual goal-seeking problem. If you free individuals up to seek their own goals, that's what's going to produce an efficient outcome. We can't simply aggregate all of the well-beings of all the different individuals and total up their goals and how close they came to accomplishing those goals, and then somehow come to a conclusion about what the optimal amount of fireworks or the optimal amount of paper being produced at paper mills might be. There's really no way to do this. From the Austrian perspective, efficiency is attained when legal institutions allow individuals to pursue their individual ends, which may be very different from one person to another. We do see conflicts that arise over the use of scarce goods, but the Austrian economist does not try to assess the value of those alternative uses because costs are subjective. They cannot be measured. Now, if you take, again, a typical mainstream kind of economics course, principles of economics maybe, or certainly an environmental economics course, you'll see a diagram very similar to this. You'll see marginal private cost, that is the cost to the owner of a resource in doing some kind of production activity, let's say a paper mill. So the private cost to the paper mill of producing paper. That's this upward sloping, lower upward sloping line here. And then you have marginal private benefit, which is the benefit to again, the paper mill for producing paper. That's a declining curve here. And so the paper mill, looking at this kind of their costs and their own benefits, they would produce a quantity of paper there at QM. That's M for market. So the argument is that this is an excessive amount of paper production because the paper mill is not taking into account the impact on bystanders of their paper production. So they're generating a bad smell, or maybe there's some water pollution or something that's coming out of their paper production process. Maybe it's logging trucks up and down the roads that are creating noise and risks of accidents as they supply the paper mill. All kinds of ways in which there might be some social cost, as the mainstream would tell us. And so for that reason, the government would then intervene with some kind of tax or subsidy. So the problem for the government then would have to be figuring out how much this tax would need to be in order to encourage the producer of the paper to take those external costs into account when deciding how much paper to produce. So the idea is the government says, well, here's how much of the external cost is falling on bystanders. We'll create a tax equal to that amount, and we'll just impose that on the paper mill. And then the paper mill is going to take that tax into account in deciding how much paper to produce. Okay, well, fine, if you know what this is, if you know what that marginal social cost is. There's no way to measure this. There's no way to get inside the heads of all the bystanders and figure out how much this cost really is. So maybe the government official says, oh, I know, I'll go around with a clipboard and a form and I'll just ask people, how much did the paper mill cost you in bad smells and traffic on the roads and looking at that big ugly steel factory, and how much did that cost you? And of course, if you work at the paper mill, you might say, well, I like the smell. It smells like money. And if you don't like the paper mill, maybe they fired you the other week, you say, well, it cost me $1 million a year. It's awful. My life is devastated because there's no way to, I mean, you can't really put that into dollar terms that would mean anything. You can play around with pretend markets and pretend prices and make up some costs, but that doesn't have any real connection to reality that we could rely upon. So some economists who acknowledge that there are these problems with externalities say, I know, I'm going to be more friendly to the market. What I'm going to do is I'm going to suggest that we create permits. And so we're going to create a permit for emitting some quantity of odor, however you'd measure that, or particulates, or in the case of power plants, maybe sulfur dioxide. And that we've actually done this in the United States with sulfur dioxide permits. So we'll just decide how much pollution is ideal, And then we'll carve that up into little permit size chunks, and we'll auction those off, or we'll grant them based on historical emissions or something like that. And we'll have the high cost, those factories that experience a high cost to reducing pollution will buy permits, and they won't reduce their pollution. And the ones that have a low cost of reducing pollution will reduce pollution so that they don't have to buy permits. So we get an efficiency here, and this is very appealing to economists who are, you know, they like the idea of markets, but they think that markets have failed here, so they need to create their own market. Okay, well, so this is not really resolving the problem. This is simply shifting it around, because you still would have to decide what Q star is. You'd have to decide what's the quantity of sulfur dioxide or the quantity of particulate matter or whatever the pollutant might be. You have to decide what that is first before you can then decide how many of these permits should be issued. And that requires, in order to know where Q star is, you have to know marginal social cost again. You're back to square one with trying to figure out how much does it cost people to have that bad odor? How much does it cost people to look out their window and see the big ugly rusting factory? That's a problem that has not gone away simply because you've got something that's tradable and looks market-ish. You haven't resolved the problem at all. And then there are political considerations. Art Carden says, the information needed to know whether a particular regulation works quite literally does not exist. And the key difference between firms and governments is that firms have market tests for their decisions, governments do not. So we're without the information that we would need in order to make these kinds of decisions. This is back to Mises' socialist calculation problem. It's the exact same problem applied to an environmental issue. Even if we could calculate the efficient quantity of pollution, how could this trump property rights? We have to think about this ethically as well as in thinking about the most efficient outcome. So the issue here then is a matter of violating the property rights of another person, not about exceeding some level of emissions or damaging the environment. I'll refer later, if I have some time, to Murray Rothbard's classic work on air pollution, law of property rights and air pollution from, I think, 1973. In any case, Rothbard does not shy away from discussing the ethical ramifications of these kinds of policies. And if there's one reading that you read to kind of support the lecture here, it would be that one. There's been a lot of recent scholarship in Austrian circles, a whole list of Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics articles that have been published in the last few years on environmental issues. It's a live debate that's going on within Austrian circles. Those of you that are interested in this issue, I encourage you to consider contributing to that literature. Let's talk a little bit about the tragedy of the commons. So again, we're back to property rights here. So if livestock are placed on a pasture that is not owned by anyone in particular, then individual livestock owners will put their livestock out on this pasture as long as the benefit to them exceeds the cost to them. So the outcome of this would very likely be an overgrazing of the pasture. The herders would be gaining all of the benefits of the grass their animals eat, but they would suffer only part of the costs. So the outcome here in a case where you don't have ownership of the pasture is that the costs are largely imposed on other livestock owners. So I put my cow out to graze on the pasture. Any grass my cow eats, I get the benefit of, but the cost of overgrazing falls on every other owner of livestock. I won't take you through the prisoner's dilemma here on this. If you like to ask about that later, I'll be happy to go through it. But Carl Menger talked about this many, many years ago. He said, when all members of society compete for a given quantity of goods that is insufficient, A practical solution to this conflict of interest is only conceivable if the goods pass into the possession of some of the economizing individuals, and if these individuals are protected by society in their possession to the exclusion of all other individuals. In other words, we resolve this problem with property rights. We put up the barbed wire around the pasture, which is beneficial to the livestock owners, because then they can restrict the use of the pasture to the maximum productivity. Ronald Coase, who is, last I heard, the most cited economist of all time, won the Nobel Prize in economics for really very, very few articles. His work on property rights is highly regarded. Coase is known for this Coase theorem, which says that in the absence of transaction costs, that is the cost of arranging a trade, the outcome will be the same regardless of the initial assignment of property rights. Now, Coase was not saying that transaction costs are zero. For Coase, he understood that they really aren't, that people who are trying to come up with a trade are going to have to negotiate, and that's costly. So he said courts ought to balance the costs and the benefits to make a determination as to who should get the property rights. And we're back to the same kind of problem we were discussing earlier, that costs and benefits are subjective. There is no way for a judge in a court, even a highly educated judge that's very familiar with the pollution problem at hand, there's no way for that judge to be able to get inside the heads of the victim of the pollution and the creator of the pollution and figure out what the optimal result is. And this creates enormous problems for the Coase theorem. So let's consider briefly a case where we have a railroad that passes by an orchard. And this is an old-style coal-fired locomotive that has sparks that fly out of the smokestack and could set fire to the orchard. So the orchards could be destroyed by sparks from the passing train. So then what should happen here? From the Coasean perspective, if the transaction costs are zero, it doesn't matter who the court decides should have the rights. Should the railroad have the right to continue to trundle along the track and emit sparks, or should the farmer have the right to have an orchard unburnt? So let's suppose that there's a $100,000 reduction in the market value of the property. So the farmer has to endure this loss of trees. The market value of the property is now only $15,000. And it would cost $120,000 for the railroad to install spark reduction devices in all of its locomotives. So should the sparks fly from the locomotives, or should the orchard be allowed to grow unburnt? So what's more valuable? Should we allow the railroad to proceed using the air as a dumping ground for its sparks, or should we allow the farmer to use the space to grow fruit? Now, to Coase, it's as though the question of who got there first, who homesteaded the right to either grow apples or drive trains down the track, that doesn't really come to the fore in his thinking. What matters here is that the outcome is going to be the same regardless of the court's decision. So the mainstream is going to look at this and say, well, $120,000 is greater than $100,000. The cost to the railroad of installing the spark reduction devices would be greater than the cost to the farmer of losing the orchard. So therefore, it's better to lose the orchard than to require the railroad to undertake that expense. So growing trees is inefficient. All right, so now let's suppose that this goes to court and the farmer gets the rights. The farmer wins in court. So the railroad would then be very willing to pay $100,000 to the farmer to avoid having to undertake the $120,000 expense of arresting the sparks. So this means that the orchard gets burnt, the devices are not installed, the farmer's fully compensated, and the railroad continues to throw the sparks. So society gains by $20,000 relative to the alternative. Now let's suppose that in an alternative case, the court awards the rights to the railroad. In this case, the farmer can't sell the orchard or a part of the orchard and raise enough money to pay the railroad to stop throwing the sparks. So there's $100,000 is the value of the orchard in the marketplace, so there's no way to raise enough money to pay for these devices to get the railroad to stop throwing sparks. So the orchard is burnt. The devices are not installed. Notice that the outcome is the same regardless of the court's decision, and that's Coase's point. However, let's introduce the subjective costs and benefits. Now, the Austrian School is going to be very attentive to this, and even though we can't measure these psychological costs and benefits, they're nonetheless real. In fact, I would suggest that we commonly accept commonly see these psychological benefits and costs. I gave my wife an engagement ring. It's a diamond. It's got a market value. I expect that she's going to hang on to that because rather than sell it, even if the price of diamonds in the marketplace goes up, because it's got sentimental value to her. This is a real sentimental value. So she's sitting here in the audience. I hope that's great. You still have that, don't you? Right. So good. We'll see what happens when the price of diamonds goes up. So what happens to this farmer if maybe the orchard has a sentimental value? Maybe this was the farmer's great-great-great-grandparents' orchard, or maybe there are other, it's a special breed of apples that's irreplaceable or something. In this case, if the railroad gets the rights, then the market value of the property was only $115,000, orchard plus the rest. And so the farmer can't raise enough money to induce the railroad to install the devices. The farmer is going to lose the orchard that was worth psychologically $900,000. So society here, including the railroad plus the farmer, loses by $880,000. A massive loss. But according to Coasians looking at this, well, market value is the only thing that they're really considering here. Murray Rothbard said, "We cannot decide on public policy, tort law, rights, or liabilities on the basis of efficiencies or minimizing of costs." And the way to resolve this, according to Rothbard, is property rights again. You can detect that running theme. So he says, well, what about water pollution? He's writing back in 1973. This is in For a New Liberty. Rothbard says, suppose a private firm owned Lake Erie. Anyone dumping garbage in the lake would be promptly sued in the courts for their aggression against private property and would be forced by the courts to pay damages and to cease and desist from any further aggression. Thus, only private property rights will ensure an end to pollution. Only because the rivers are unowned is there no owner to rise up and defend his precious resource from attack. If, in contrast, anyone should dump garbage or pollutants into a lake which is privately owned, he would not be permitted to do so for very long. The owner would come roaring to its defense. And I'll mention also a recent book that's come out by Walter Block and Peter Nelson. It's available in the bookstore, I believe. Water Capitalism, the Case for Privatizing Oceans, Rivers, Lakes, and Aquifers. Now, about all of that plastic. Anyone here have a plastic soda straw? No? Very, very correct of you. Okay. Now, you've heard about maybe the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, floating mats of plastic supposedly in the Pacific. And we're told in the United States, so you need to use a paper straw or a reusable metal straw or something, because to use a plastic straw is environmentally irresponsible. It's going to wind up in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. Well, it turns out about 90% of all the plastic that reaches the world's oceans gets flushed through just 10 rivers, and I don't know if you know where all those are, but none of them are in North America. American plastic is not getting washed into the ocean for the most part. In fact, most of that plastic is fishing gear. Fishing nets account for 46% of the trash, with the majority of the rest composed of other fishing industry gear. 20% of the debris is from the 2011 Japanese tsunami. Now, the ocean is, for practical purposes, unowned. So I suggest you go and take a look at Walter Block's book, Block and Nelson's book on water capitalism. People say, well, you know, that's just a libertarian pipe dream for privatizing the ocean. I mean, good grief, how would you possibly do that? Maybe we need to think a little more broadly about this. And I think that one of the reasons we're concerned about pollution in these kind of commonly owned or commonly regarded areas might be because there's simply no property rights that are effective in those places. I'm going to skip over some of this just in the interest of time. Let me point out that homesteading of property rights can take place in more than just land. We tend to think of homesteading as something that applies to square footage of land or acreage of land, but in fact, you could have noise homesteading. If I'm accustomed to a certain level of quiet in my neighborhood and along comes a factory next door and starts creating a racket, then I, under a property rights protective regime, would have the right to sue in court and win an injunction against the creator of the noise. The same would go for air pollution. Air presents some special problems because it, of course, flows across boundaries as noise does, but there's no reason why that could not be homesteaded as well. In fact, we see a court case from 1932 that dealt with exactly that issue. In fact, I think this is one of the court cases that Ronald Coase mentions in one of his most famous essays. So we can boil this down to issues of trespass and nuisance. We can think about the impact of air pollution as being similar in nature to someone driving down the road in front of my house and dropping a bag of garbage in my front yard. I would have recourse in court for someone who tried to do that. And in the same way, we could see that with boundary crossings of other sorts, radio waves perhaps, or air traffic. Now, Rothbard does make a distinction. I won't get into too much detail on this, but he says there's a distinction between boundary crossings that you can't sense and that you can't really tell that they're creating a problem. Like radio waves. I'm being bombarded with radio waves right now. I expect most of them are pretty harmless. I would have to be able to show that they are harmful in order for me to be able to obtain an injunction against those. I'll leave you to read Law of Property Rights and Air Pollution on your own. I did want to say one thing about government and environmental crisis before we wrap up here. There are certain cases of environmental problems that have emerged as kind of poster children for environmental crisis, and one of these was the Love Canal episode from the 1970s and 80s, which was a failed canal that was later used as a dumping ground for toxic waste. Now, in fact, the private firm that used the canal to dump waste was doing so responsibly according to the standards of the time. The canal was sealed so that toxic waste could not leak, and in fact it seemed to work pretty well, and they capped it off with clay, and it seemed that the toxic waste was safely contained. By the way, the Army and the local municipal government also contributed toxic waste to this dump, even though later the private firm was the one blamed for this crisis. So then in 1953, the city government decided they would like to have this land, and they threatened the company with eminent domain unless the company turned over the land to the to the city to use as a school. Great idea, right? So the company said, you should not do this. There's toxic waste underground here. They took the school board officials out to the property and drilled 8 test wells, drilled 2 over the dump, and sure enough, up comes toxic waste, and drilled on the sides, and no toxic waste. So you see, there it is. It's contained. You really don't want to be messing with this toxic waste site. Nevertheless, the city said, nope, we're taking your land, or you're going to sell it to us. Take your pick. So they said, fine, we'll sell it to you for $1. And they wanted to put into the deed that there's toxic waste here. They put what for a deed is a fairly long section, and they're saying this is a waste site. You shouldn't do anything with it except make it into a park, maybe. But the city said, no, we're not going to make it into a park. We're going to build a school on it. We're going to sell off the rest to developers, without saying quite as much as you have said about the toxic waste. And by the way, we're going to put some storm drains in here, and we're going to, that involves poking holes in the clay barrier. So, I mean, here comes the city government, says, you're going to give this to us. The company then is, well, we're telling you what's there, and the city government then pokes holes in the clay barrier, scoops off the clay top of this thing, and carries it off to use as fill dirt at another site for a school, and in other ways just disturbs the entire capsule of toxic waste. And sure enough, later on, the residents in the area find that there are enormous health problems that emerge, birth defects and other problems. So the story here, as it's often portrayed, is that private firms just completely misbehaved here, and they had no regard for human safety and no regard for the future consequences of their dump site. But in fact, they had. The city, when they were told and were complained to by the residents, responded initially by saying, well, it's not really that much of a problem. Here you can have a window fan to air out your house from that bad odor that's creeping into your basement. So this ended up being the case that was again the poster child for what later became the Superfund law, which was a massive intervention of government into toxic waste sites, where if they could find some company still around that might have contributed to the toxic waste that was leaking, then that company could be saddled with the cost of the cleanup. There are other cases I don't have time to go through here, but I do hope that you will take the time to read the Rothbard essay, and if you like, if you want to email me, I can send you some other readings that might help as you're thinking through this, and this list here would be part of that. Just some essays in the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics that deal with environmental questions. So thank you very much. I'll be happy to talk to you afterward if you like. Oh yeah, they got saddled with like $2 billion worth of lawsuits.
Even though they said don't, like.
Oh yeah, yeah, huge lawsuits. I mean, the company did some things that were not really smart. They
All right. Well, judging from the clock at the back of the room, and also from Verizon, I like to say I'm a slave to Verizon when it comes to time. They say it's 4 o'clock, so I suppose it's time for me to begin. Right. So I want to start by speculating a little bit about kind of the audience that I'm talking to. Because I know, right, you had a choice, right? You chose to come, right, to this talk rather than the more interesting talk on oil downstairs. Right? So I figure you must fall into one of a few different categories, right? It might be that you're here to hear my garden update, in which case I'm going to have to disappoint you. I couldn't figure out how to work it in, but if you want to talk to me afterward, that's perfectly fine. I can give the update. A second reason, though, that I'm not giving it is that my garden actually went fairly well this year, so it's not nearly as funny as it normally is. Okay. It's true. But a second type of student that I think would probably be in this room would be the type of a student who has already attended lectures on money, on banking, on Austrian business cycle theory, on the Rothbardians versus the free bankers, on Austrian versus monetarist and Keynesian macroeconomics, and is planning to attend lectures on modern monetary theory and the gold standard versus fiat money and so on. So this naturally fits in. Right? You're the kind of student that really just wants to get as much money as possible in the theoretical sense. Right? And I can appreciate that, right? Because I became an economist because I'd rather study money than have any. So we're two of a kind, I suppose. All right, let's go ahead and hop in. Right? So the topic here is monetary policy, looking at discretion, rules, and markets as being 3 different possible approaches. Now, before we get into this, let's talk about, first, why do we bother thinking about monetary policy, right, policy there, and secondly, what do we mean by monetary policy? Right, so first, I want to lay out 2 different problems, right, that I think commonly, economists would agree these are connected with the way that money is working the economy. Right, so the first problem would be business cycles. I think generally speaking, certainly we as Austrians would say money is kind of at the root of the business cycle going wrong, right? It's money coming in through credit markets, credit expansion, and all of that. So money plays a role in business cycles. We don't particularly like business cycles. We do theoretically. I love business cycle theory, but experiencing the business cycle is not something I enjoy, right? So I like studying it so that I can make people's lives better, right? If we can have better monetary policy, we may have fewer or less severe business cycles, people will suffer less, right? And since I'm not a horrible human being, less human suffering sounds good to me. Right? A second issue, though, that is very connected with the monetary system is that of hyperinflation. And so I want to talk a little bit about the hyperinflation process and the way that it has tended to work historically. When we see these hyperinflationary episodes, whether it be in Weimar Germany or whether it be in Zimbabwe, or more recently, say, we see something very similar happening in Venezuela, whenever we see these happen, at the root of it is something happening on the monetary side of the economy. Right? Typically, what happens is we have a government that has decided it wants to spend a bunch of money on various programs, but it wants to spend more than it can reasonably collect in taxes, right? Taxes are not popular. If you want to stay in power, you don't want to raise taxes too much. But they also want to spend more than they can reasonably borrow because, again, you have to convince somebody to lend to you. If you're already spending a lot of money, you're not really looking like a great risk for me to lend to you. Right, so what do we do instead? Well, let's just print the difference. Right? So we print money and then we spend it. Right? Naturally, this means there's an increase in the supply of money, as Dr. Klein explained earlier. Right? When you increase the supply of something, right, its value falls and the supply is to money. Right? So the purchasing power of money declines, but you need more money to buy any particular thing. Right? Now, where hyperinflation comes in is when people begin to realize, right, that their money is regularly declining in value, right? And they realize then it doesn't really make sense, right, to hold a lot of money. Right? Like, because normally I want to hold some money because I never know when I might want to, I don't know, buy a soft drink or something like that from a vending machine, sure. So I hold some money for these unexpected purchases. Right? But when I realize that that money is losing value regularly and quickly, I don't want to hold on to money. I'll hold something else, right, that is not losing value regularly and quickly. Right? So what happens then is we not just have an increase in the supply of money for funding what the government's wanting to do, but we also see a decrease in the demand for money. Right? And as Dr. Klein explained earlier, when the demand for something declines, it loses value. Right? Same thing applies to money. Right? When the demand for money declines, money loses value, the purchasing power of money falls more. You need even more money, right, to buy stuff. In other words, prices are going up very rapidly because we have both things that could potentially lead prices to go up happening at the same time. An increase in the supply and a decrease in the demand for money. And we have realized, and this is true not just amongst Austrian economists, but the mainstream realizes that these hyperinflationary episodes are monetary in nature. Right? Inflation is everywhere and always a monetary phenomenon. And that's especially true in these hyperinflationary episodes. And we know that when hyperinflation happens, it leads to great suffering because we basically are abandoning the monetary system, right? All of the benefits that come with having this common medium of exchange that everyone accepts, right? That allows us to exchange with each other, even if, say, I want to eat, right? And you are a farmer and you don't want economics lessons, right? I can still buy food from you because money exists, right? I'll sell my economics lessons to somebody that wants them and then buy the food from you. Right, so this is all right, coming out of and repeating to some degree the things that Professor Klein talked about earlier. And so these hyperinflationary episodes, people are abandoning this monetary system. Now we're stuck back in a barter economy. This is not a good thing. We're made much less productive, much more difficult to trade and to survive, even for that matter. Okay, so that's a second problem that can arise out of the monetary system. So it seems then that we want to do something, right, to both offset business cycles, right, to prevent them from happening, to make them less severe, less common, but we also want to avoid the worst case scenario of hyperinflation, which is utterly devastating to the economy. Right? So how can we arrange the economic system in such a way that we have a money that will not fall into, right, these two potential disasters? So then what is monetary policy? Right, so monetary policy would be the set of laws, the set of regulations, rules, and so on that are about, right, the value of money and typically will relate to the supply of money, how much is being provided, right, to the economy. Okay. Now, when you look in the mainstream, the main discussion at the moment is between kind of these two views of how we should do monetary policy. Right? Should we do monetary policy? One basis, right, would be on the basis of discretion. Right? So what discretion simply means, right, is that we have a group of people that get together. Right? They should be people that might know something about the way the economy works, right, are trained in this, right, perhaps have some experience in working in the economy in some fashion. Perhaps they're economists, right, meet together, right, try to figure out what the optimal money supply is at the moment. Optimal money supply, I feel like that was mentioned previously. Oh yeah, it's Dr. Klein again, so okay. Let's try to figure out what the optimal money supply is at the moment to try to get the economy to do the things we want it to do, have a nice stable economic growth, make sure we don't have hyperinflation. And of course, we know this is the way that, say, the American system works. We have the Federal Open Market Committee, right, gets together, this combination of the Board of Governors, which by design should be 7 people, but in reality at the moment is 5. We also have a handful of people that, that are working at the various regional Federal Reserve banks. Right? So we pick a few of those presidents, 5 out of the, I believe, 12, right, are also serving on this board, and we all talk about what it looks like the economy is doing, what we should do in response to it. So the big reason for why somebody would advocate this sort of system, right, is that we believe that people, right, can actually exercise judgment in a meaningful way. Right? That is that we can look at data, we can interpret it, right, using our own understanding, right, and make decisions accordingly, and these will actually be reasonably good decisions. Right? Now, on the other hand, right, some would point out problems with this sort of system. Probably one of the most famous, at least one of my favorite quotes from Milton Friedman, right? He says, the problem with the system is that sometimes, right, people make mistakes. Right? This is something I learned as a child because I watched Sesame Street. Right? Everybody makes mistakes, right? And this is supposed to make us feel somewhat better about the fact that we make mistakes. Right? So everybody makes mistakes. Right? We have to be understanding, right, toward ourselves and toward others when this happens. But Milton Friedman pointed out that when you have a system like, say, the Federal Reserve System with the FOMC running things, right, if somebody makes a mistake there, it has enormous consequences, right? He particularly had in mind what happened with the Great Depression in the United States, where in his mind, right, the Fed totally dropped the ball on that, specifically in that they let the money supply fall rapidly amidst people wanting more money. This is not the way that things should work, and he considered this to be really the reason we had a Great Depression. Right? So the quote from him was that, well, any system where mistakes made by so few can have such bad effects for so many is a bad system. Right? Right. Okay, we agree, right? Discretion is, ideally we like to exercise judgment with things, but But if so few people making mistakes lead to outrageously bad consequences for so many people, maybe we need to rethink the system. I would point to another potential problem with this system of discretion, and that is that often there's political pressure, right, that is placed on our deciders, right, to allow a little bit more inflation, to be a little bit easier, right, on the economy in order to create an economy that's booming. Right? After all, we know that if the economy is booming, it's going to be a lot easier to get reelected. Right? So there's some pressure put onto the Federal Reserve. Right? Keep interest rates a little bit lower. Let's lower them down a little bit more, maybe all the way to zero. I might want to nominate somebody to the Federal Reserve Board that would do that for me, right? Because that's going to help me get reelected in the future. Now, economists throughout pretty much all of the mainstream realize that this is potentially a problem, and that's why you often will see people advocating for the independence, right, of the central bank. Right? It should not be too closely connected to the political system, or it can fall to these sort of pressures. Although we do know that there are a couple exceptions to that nowadays. One exception being those that like modern monetary theory. They say, no, we need to get rid of this independence, that in fact printing money to fund the government's the way to go. I'll talk more about that in my lecture tomorrow afternoon. Also, strangely, Art Laffer came out saying he doesn't really know why the Federal Reserve is independent nowadays anyway, which I don't know what reading he's been doing recently, but it's clearly not about mainstream economists talking about the Federal Reserve or central banking, because they generally would favor independence if we're going to have a central bank that's just operating on the basis of discretion. Okay. Right, so discretion is the one possibility. Right? The other possibility that is often discussed in the mainstream, right, would be having some kind of rule. Right, so we realize that any system where so few people making mistakes can have such outrageously bad consequences for so many people is a bad system, so let's make it so that we don't have people making mistakes. How do you avoid that? Well, we don't have people making decisions. If you don't make a decision, you're not going to make a mistake, right? So we implement some kind of rule. Famously, Friedman was one that advocated for what has become known as the Friedman rule. It's really quite simple. It's so simple that a calculator can do it. We don't even need people, right? So we could end the Fed, replace the Fed with a calculator. That's perfectly fine as far as Friedman is concerned. Just increase the money supply by a constant percentage each year. Right, so he normally advocated somewhere between 3% and 5% being reasonable. He thought that typically the economy would grow roughly 3 to 5% per year. So roughly 3 to 5% more money in the economy will keep prices roughly stable on average. Right? So let's just do that. Right? It's much simpler. We're not going to make outrageously bad mistakes. Of course, other rules have come along, right? We have the Taylor rule, which is probably one of my favorites if we're going to pick a rule. John Taylor suggests that we should have a rule that's a little bit more complicated than the Friedman rule and have it respond to what the economy is doing, right? So if the economy is booming, interest rates will rise. If the economy is doing poorly, interest rates will fall. If inflation goes up, interest rates will rise. If inflation is down, interest rates will fall, which anybody who's taken any kind of macroeconomics class where they talk about monetary policy, this is typically what the advice is that is given, right? Higher inflation, you should increase interest rates to offset it, right? That's just kind of standard. But he has put all of this in a nice little, very simple, right, mathematical formula for how we can figure out what the interest rate should be, right, that would then regulate the economy very simply, right, and so on. Yeah, there are other possibilities out there. Inflation targeting is another one you hear. The idea of inflation targeting is the central bank will pick an explicit inflation target, say, well, we want prices to go up, let's say between 2 and 3% on average over the next 5 years, and they're going to act in such a way to try to make that happen. Right? So that's another possibility that's out there, and a few countries have tried this and have actually seemed to hit these inflation targets reasonably well. Right? Another, which is probably more common amongst those that are, say, Austrians or closer to the Austrians, would be NGDP targeting. So it's nominal GDP targeting. Right? So this was very strongly favored by Scott Sumner, who's kind of the big advocate of this. But also there are some Austrians, Horwitz and Luther, would be a couple that have written a couple papers related to this, consider this to be a reasonable way, right, to do monetary policy. Right, so the idea here, nominal GDP, is basically adding up all of the spending that's happening in the economy. Right, so we try to stabilize that, right? Perhaps have it grow at some moderate level, or perhaps have it be totally stable. It doesn't really make a whole lot of difference, but this is the way we should do monetary policy, try to stabilize that nominal GDP. Okay, right, so rather than go through these rules one by one and try to critique, well, here's the problem with Friedman, here's the problem with Taylor, and so on, I want to deal with the idea of rules, right, first. So first, why would we bother having a rule? Well, this relates to, right, Friedman's critique from before, right, and that we're removing human judgment, which can sometimes be erroneous, right? We're replacing with rules, right? So no longer will we have people making mistakes. Right. Also, it will be the case, right, and as far as errors and expectations, right, are creating economic problems, right, if you have a very nice predictable rule, right, then you're not going to have errors and expectations, right? So if I, as a business owner, when I'm making decisions, I say, gee, I really think that my decision depends on the rate of growth in the money supply. One, I've not met this business owner, but if that happens to be you, right, and you're in a system of discretion, well, you really can't predict very far out, right, what the money supply is going to look like. On the other hand, if Friedman gets his way, right, you can predict forever, right, what the money supply is going to be as long as people continue to follow this rule, right? So we're following a Friedman rule of 3% a year. I can tell you what the money supply will be 300 years from now. As long as I know it now, and as long as I can use a calculator, I can predict the money supply, right? So any errors related to me getting the money supply wrong, we would avoid. All right. On the other hand, right, we have a few problems with rules in general. Right? One would be that very much like there might be political pressure put on the Federal Reserve, for example, right, to play with interest rates a specific way, we could also see political power over these rules. Right? Who, after all, is setting the rule in the first place? Right? Well, I suspect it's probably the same organization that created the Federal Reserve. That would be Congress, right, passing a law, right, president signing it, and that puts things into place. Well, who's it that's putting in place the rule? Similarly, I suspect it would be Congress, right, passing some legislation. This gets signed, which means at any point, right, Congress could pass different legislation, right, amending what that rule is, right, how it works, what that percentage increase is for Friedman, or whatever it happens to be. Right? A second problem, right, which doesn't rely on this political issue, right, would be economic measurement errors. And this is not so much a problem for Friedman, but it is potentially a very big problem for people like Taylor. Right? For me to be able to say, here's what the economy is doing in terms of real GDP, and here's what inflation is doing in terms of prices, right? I have to have data on these things, right, that is actually reliable so that I can make decisions in the moment what I should do with monetary policy. Right? But if you actually pay attention to, say, GDP and how these releases work, right, one is that they're very slow. You don't find out what GDP was in, say, March in April. It doesn't happen quite that fast, right? Secondly, it's not just that they're slow, right, but they're always revised, right? You typically will get, say, GDP calculations 3 different times, right? So first, oh, here's our preliminary numbers. Okay, well, that was based on preliminary data, but that wasn't totally correct. So here's some additional numbers. So here's the official number that you're getting now a month later. But then we got some additional data. So here's the revised number. Right? So we don't actually know where we are, right, economically at any particular point in time for any of the data that would go into something like a Taylor rule. Right? So these economic measurement errors can mean that, in fact, the rule is making mistakes, even on its own terms, just because the data going into it isn't very good. Right? A third issue, which I think as Austrians we should take with this, is that all of these have underlying them this assumption that the economy is some kind of static thing, or that it operates like a machine, right? Right? If you always do the same input, you always get the same output out of it, right? Right? So we follow this rule. It's something that's very, right, regular and static and so on, right? Stick the same input in, right? We should get the same output out. But of course, we know that the economy is composed of actual people, and people change their minds, right? There are no constants, right, in human action. And so there are issues, right, when we look at rules. So now I want to look at, and I would point out that a lot of these critiques that I've given to this point are things that are not specifically Austrian, right? You find these same critiques, right, inside the mainstream. The people that like discretion are saying these things to the people that like rules. People like rules are saying these things to the people that like discretion. So I want to take a little bit more of what I consider to be an Austrian approach with this next set of, I guess, comments. Right. So let's think by analogy. Why don't we produce shoes by a rule? So think about that for a moment, right? Okay. Why is it, right, that economists that would typically accept, right, that the way we do shoe production works reasonably well would turn around, right, here I have in mind people like Friedman, right, would turn around and say, well, we really need to produce money by a rule. Right? Well, what is so radically different? Right? Well, I would suggest, right, that the reason we don't produce shoes by rule, right, is that we do recognize, right, that leaving some room for entrepreneurial judgment actually makes sense. Right? Even though we know that today, right, the way that kind of modern corporations work is that they do actually look at big data. It's the age of big data. Right? So we gather all kinds of data about what's happening with shoe sales, demographics, and what have you. Right? We calculate all of this, try to figure out how many various types of shoes people would like. Right? We do this, but in the end, right, it is the entrepreneur, right, making the choice, like deciding what to do or not. How much do they trust, right, the results that the big data is giving them? How do they weight that result versus their own ideas of what should happen? And I think we recognize this is actually the right way to do it. Right? That there is something in that human understanding that cannot quite be captured, right, by the statistics, though they may be helpful, right, in informing that understanding. Right, so this would suggest, right, that if we believe that entrepreneurial judgment is useful, then something like discretion does sound good. Right? I would suggest just thinking more about this idea of a shoe rule. Like the more I think about it, the more it seems like, would it make sense or not? I'm not quite sure. Right? After all, like population is somewhat predictable. Right? It grows somewhat predictably. Right? Certainly, like after any particular cohort is born, right? Watching demographics over age is fairly simple, right? So right now we're doing predictions regarding how much demand there will be for higher education over the next 18 years, and we can have a reasonably good approximation, right? And so maybe we could, right, do actually something like a shoe rule, right? Seems possible, right? But yet we come back to that question of, shoes are not that simple, right? It's not a matter of producing the right number of shoes. You have to produce the right style and all of that, right? Get them to the right place, the right time, and so on, right? So entrepreneurial judgment again comes in because there is complication when you're dealing with human beings, right? Now, I would also suggest, right, that the Friedman critique, right, is extremely important, right, in that it points out something very specific about the way the monetary system works that is very different from something like shoe production. Right? So remember, go back to Friedman, right, this great quote, right, any system where mistakes made by so few have such bad effects for so many is a bad system. Now let's think about this with shoes, right? What happens if, say, Adidas does something absolutely stupid, right? They decide, well, all we're going to produce, we think that really there's going to be a lot of demand for size 14 hot pink sneakers, and that's all we're going to produce, right? Just producing a bunch of hot pink size 14s. What happens, right? Well, I think we agree that they probably don't sell very well. And so we have lots of hot pink shoes that are being produced that people don't particularly want to buy, either because they don't like hot pink or because that's not the right size, right? So we end up with lots of shoes. Now, is this a waste for society? Well, yes, it is, right? Lots of resources, right, just went into producing size 14 hot pink shoes, right? That we are, in fact, made worse off because of this, right? But where does the burden of that mistake fall? Right. It falls primarily on Adidas. Right? They're the ones that paid a whole bunch of costs, right? And now are not receiving that money back. Right? So the shareholders, right, that did not immediately kick people out of positions in upper leadership, they're going to be paying quite a bit because of this, right, as their corporation is taking losses. But so mostly, when they're making the mistake, right, the burden is falling primarily, right, on the one making the mistake. Right? In this case, on the corporation making this totally stupid choice regarding the shoes they're creating. Okay. Right. Now, what about the consumers? Now, we are made somewhat worse off, less choice involved, but the way we get around that is that I suspect these shoes will end up being very, very cheap. Right? It's not worth zero, maybe, but sell them for a couple dollars a piece, that kind of thing. Right? Okay, so the effect on consumers is basically minimal. Right? We have a few less of the other shoes we might actually want, but the shoes we got are really cheap. The burden, again, right, falls primarily on Adidas. Okay. What happens, though, right, when the Federal Reserve makes a mistake, right, and the economy goes through a recession? Right? Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's it. Right? The Federal Reserve does not suffer because of this, right? Now, it might be that, leadership we don't like as well, but on the other hand, because of independence, they're not so easy to remove, right? So they're still there, right, for quite a while, right? Okay, right? Does the Federal Reserve take losses? Well, no, typically not. In fact, profit and loss as an incentive is shut down for the system. As Dr. Howden described earlier, the way the Federal Reserve System works, right? The way it raises money is it buys up these government bonds and receives interest, uses these interests to pay expenses, and there's a bunch of money left over, tens of billions of dollars, right? This does not go right to the shareholders of the Federal Reserve System, and if there's a mistake, they pay for it. No, it goes back to the Treasury. Right, so the Fed doesn't suffer from its own mistakes. Okay. Well, this is a failure, or rather, better put, a lack of profit and loss, the typical way that the economy works. If people make mistakes when they're running their businesses, then they end up taking losses. And if they do this enough, over time, they'll find that they just don't have the resources left to continue in business. We're reallocating resources away from those making mistakes toward those that are making profits. How do you make a profit? You find resources that people don't really have much use for and are therefore relatively cheap. You make something people really are willing to pay for. You sell it. You make that difference between the two. That's an entrepreneurial profit based on the judgment that you have made. Okay. And what happens over time? You earn these profits, you can reinvest them in your business. The good decision makers are the ones that can continue to grow their businesses and have a larger and larger effect on how resources are used. Not so with the Federal Reserve System. If they make profits, it doesn't actually make any difference. It goes back to the Treasury. If they don't make profits again, it doesn't actually make any difference. The Treasury just gets slightly less. So we don't have any kind of profit or loss calculation here, or any kind of motive here that could possibly be driving the Federal Reserve when it's making these choices. Now, a second problem, though, is that another thing that was pointed out is not just that we have this profit and loss missing, but there's a lack of alternatives. When we look at the American system, can I really easily say, oh, I'm just going to abandon Federal Reserve notes and start using something else? Now, I could try and say, well, I'm just going to operate in Bitcoin from now on. Unfortunately, I very much doubt that Kent State University will pay me in Bitcoin. So I'm going to have to change my employer to somebody that's going to pay me in Bitcoin. Perhaps I'll go work for Overstock or something like that. And I'm only going to buy from places that will sell to me in Bitcoin. Now, I will note that I did pick the right state to live in, because Ohio has recently said that it will accept Bitcoin in payment of taxes. So, okay, so I will be able to pay my taxes, at least to the state, legally. That's fine, But I'm going to have to really change the way I live my life if I try to find an alternative to using Federal Reserve notes, or dollars more broadly. There's a lack of alternatives, and that's a big part of the problem. Whereas this is not so much the case with things like shoes. If Adidas does something stupid, I can buy Nike, I can buy Reebok, or what have you. There are other options out there. You might see where I'm going with some of this, potentially. But if not, we'll get there directly right now. All right, so how then should our monetary system operate from a Misesian standpoint? Now, I will say, Mises lays out, this is all from the Theory of Money and Credit. You can buy copies downstairs. I would suggest that if you do decide you want to read the Theory of Money and Credit, I'd say it's a book of its time in many ways. So a lot of it, he's dealing with debates that are happening in the early 1900s. He's using terms in a way that are different than what we would use them today if, say, you take Econ 101, that kind of thing. So I would strongly advise have somebody to guide you through it. One option would be Dr. Murphy's study guide to the Theory of Money and Credit. I should start getting commission from selling these things, but I have not asked for it yet. All right, so in that book, Mises lays out there are two sides to what he considers to be an ideal monetary policy. The first is a positive affirmation of the market's choice of money. That is that legally, we should recognize what the market has chosen as a money. Secondly, there should be some form of obstruction that will prevent government from meddling in the currency. So he realizes there are this potential for political pressures. There should be some kind of barriers put in place to prevent government from stepping in. So practically, how do we do this? So I'm going to lay out two different approaches that different Austrians have suggested. I will be somewhat agnostic myself between these approaches and say, whichever one that we can actually manage to convince somebody to do, I will not complain about. So the first one is to revive the gold dollar. So this is the approach that both Mises and Rothbard have suggested. And now their approaches are slightly different from each other. But at heart, the idea is that we already have a bunch of dollars being used here in the United States. Let's reconnect that dollar back with gold. We know it was connected with gold originally. That connection was broken through the course of the 30s and 70s. So let's reestablish that connection. Okay. So the Misesian approach, what Mises lays out in the theory of money and credit when he's looking at monetary reconstruction, is a few steps, right? So first, he says we should stop issuing additional paper dollars. He's not saying we need to burn all the ones that are out there, just don't issue any more at this point. Now, after we do that, we also want to make sure there are no gold sales by the Fed or by the Treasury. Okay. And so we don't want anything messing with what's happening in the gold market. And he suggests that if we do this, these two things, right, first stop issuing paper dollars, secondly, don't allow any gold sales, right, from the authorities, right, the price of gold will stabilize. And he says when that happens, right, then we'll establish parity at whatever that price happens to be. Right, so if it just so happens that after we make these announcements, okay, we're not going to issue no more paper dollars, right, we're not going to sell any gold at this point, we just want to see where the price is going to stabilize, maybe it stabilizes at, say, $2,500 an ounce. Okay. Right. Once we see that stability, he says, okay, then we can step in and say, now, a gold and $2,500, right, those are just equivalent to each other, right? $2,500 is the name, right, for an ounce of gold, or it's simply by definition the same thing. If you have $2,500 and you want to hand them in to the Federal Reserve, we'll give you, right, that ounce gold coin, or vice versa, you have an ounce of gold, right, you want the 2,500 paper dollars, you can do that, right? We can establish parity at that level. Right, so he says we create this conversion agency, right, that is going to then just handle, right, these transactions as people want to either use the physical gold or use the paper equivalent. I would note this idea of a conversion agency, this is not something that is totally foreign to our experience. Not so much recently with gold, but we do have, say, some countries that have pegged their currencies to, say, the dollar, right, that establish currency boards, right, to do this. Right? So the currency board is then in charge of ensuring that if anybody brings in a certain number of dollars, right, then they receive whatever the legal equivalent is in their home currency and vice versa. Right? So that's the same idea here, applied, though, to a conversion agency. He also suggests, here you can tell the time he was writing, he says we need to eliminate all large bills, though, as time goes on. He says anything $5 and up. Yeah, $5 may have been a large bill in around 1920. It's not really a large bill today. But the idea is that when we have these large enough bills, maybe in today's, you might say something like $100 and up might be about right, proportionally. Right, so no bills, right, for $100 and up. There, instead, you use gold coins. Right, so then people get used to, at least for large transactions, actually using, right, the physical gold, thinking of gold as being the actual money, rather than only thinking about paper as being money, which made breaking the connection much easier than it otherwise would have been. And so this is the Misesian approach. Rothbard takes a somewhat different approach, one that I think could probably be established much, much faster as far as that goes. And so Rothbard would say, well, we have measures of the money supply. We also have some sense, assuming they're not lying to us, of how much gold holdings we have, right, in the Fed and the Treasury. Right? So why don't we just immediately establish, right, what the ratio is between the two? Right? So I did some calculations. Personally, I like M2. It's the kind of thing that happens when you're an economist. You have a favorite money supply measure. Okay, so if I'm not allowed to choose the true money supply or the Austrian money supply, which Dr. Newman talked about, I'll choose M2. These tend to be reasonably close together. Right? Okay. All right, so and that's, last I checked it, was $14.7 trillion. Okay? When it comes to how much gold is being held by the government, you have to do some research to figure this out. But what I found, based on, this is from first the Federal Reserve, their balance sheet. It says that they have a certain dollar amount of gold. I think it's like $11 billion. Right? But that amount, strangely, you'll notice, if you look over time, that $11 billion doesn't change, despite the fact that the price of gold changes. Right? It's one reason people argue against a gold standard is the price of gold changes. How is it that your asset is changing in value, but the asset is not changing in value on your balance sheet? Well, it's because it's on there on a legal basis. Right? There's a specific price that it was at. Right? I think it's around $40 or so an ounce. Right? It's drastically underpriced as an asset at this point. Right? So doing the math, you say, okay, I found that would be roughly 261 million ounces, right? That are owned, right, by the Federal Reserve or the Treasury. Exactly the legal standing there is a little bit fuzzy too. This combination, roughly 261 million ounces, it's not that hard to do the division, right? So 14.7 trillion divided by 261 million, I'll give you a couple seconds to work that out. That's right, it's roughly $56,000 per ounce. Right, so what Rothbard would say is, Well, we know how much money is out there and what we would generally consider money. We know how much gold there is. Let's just establish parity immediately, right? $56,000 per ounce will do it, and then we don't have any problems of, oh, maybe we'll run out of gold if people decide they really don't want paper dollars, right, or what have you. Okay. Right, so in that case, everybody, right, could take all of their savings accounts, all their checking accounts, all the paper dollars you actually have in your pocket, right? We could all rush to the Fed, right, hand them in, and they'd say $56,000 per ounce, we hand you the gold, and there's no problem except that it's a long line, right, that's it. Right? No issue of like, oh, we don't have enough gold to back every dollar, if that's the ratio we choose. And naturally, there will be a certain amount of adjustment in this change in the value of gold from, what is it recently? Something a little under $2,000 an ounce. So it's been bouncing between like 1,500 and 2,000 as long as I've been watching it, I think, right, at least recently. And so that's the idea here. I suspect we'll find ways to economize on the use of gold, right, which I might want to try to convince my wife that it's not so important that I wear this anymore. I suspect I will not succeed. But anyway, well, we could pay off a good part of the house right here. Anyway, right. So that's one option, right? Let's bring back the gold dollar by reconnecting, right, gold, right, with the dollar that we have. Now, one thing that is very good about this system is that it realizes that there is a certain amount of momentum, right, when it comes to money. Right? Getting people to switch, right, from one money to another is a difficult thing to do. Right? So we're letting people, they can keep using the dollars they're used to, right? Just now it is actually connected to gold. Right? Okay, that's nice. Right? So a second option, though, right, is currency competition. Right? So this is something that was suggested, at least in a particular form, by Friedrich Hayek in his Denationalization of Money, also by Hans Sennholz in a slightly different form in Money and Freedom. Both of these books are downstairs in the bookstore. I will particularly say I really liked Money and Freedom when I read it. So, Hans Sennholz taught at Grove City College. He was gone before I was a student there, right? But I kind of feel like there's a legacy there that I need to carry on or something like that. Yeah, so the basic idea of currency and competition, and here I'm going to pull more from the Sennholz version, is that we allow people to use whatever currency you want. Right? So if you want to use dollars because you like dollars, you're used to dollars, that's fine. If you decide for some reason you prefer euros, okay, go ahead. Doesn't matter that we're not in Europe, you go ahead and use them. If you'd rather use British pounds, fine. Bitcoin, fine. If you want to use gold coins, fine. If you want to use Liberty dollars, which the government stomped down on a few years ago, go ahead and do that silver-based currency. It doesn't really, like legally, you're not going to run into any issues. Now, in order to make that happen, what that requires is that we eliminate legal tender laws. Right? Legal tender laws, what they do, you can see this if you pull out, right, any, say, American money. It says on there, right, this is legal tender for all debts, public and private. Right? What that means is that if you owe someone a debt, they're legally required, right, to accept dollars in payment for that debt. And that's really all it means, is that everybody has to accept, right, dollars under our system. So by eliminating legal tender, what does that mean? It means that I can write a debt contract where I require payment in something else, and I do not accept dollars in exchange, right? So I could say, you know, okay, I will sell you this house, right, in exchange, right? There's this debt, you have to pay me back an ounce of gold per year over the next 30 years, that kind of thing. And if you come to me and say, I don't have an ounce of gold, I say, you better get one, or I'll take the house back. Oh, but I have some dollars. No, the contract says gold, it's going to be gold, right? Nowadays, you can't do this, right? Legally, I have to accept, right, gold in some ratio. Okay. All right, so eliminate legal tender laws. Now, that doesn't mean you can't make contracts on the basis of dollars. You can, certainly, just you're not required to, right? It also, another point of currency competition under the Sennholz version would be free entry in currency. Right, so anybody who wants to start producing currencies is allowed to. Right, so if I wanted to start producing Engelhardt dollars, right, so. See, people learn by experience better than by words. There we go. That's one Engelhardt dollar right there. Right? Wonderful, right? So I could start producing these, right? And then I could offer, I just had somebody rebuild my deck. I could offer, oh, you accept Engelhardt dollars. Right? He'd say no, right? Right? But free entry does not guarantee, right, that the thing is accepted, right? So, okay. Right, so if people want to start trying to produce their own currencies to compete with the dollar, they're allowed to. I would note this is not allowed under our current legal system. That's why I got the Liberty dollar in trouble, was that it was perceived that they were trying to compete, right, with the American dollar. Right? Of course, they actually were, but legally they weren't allowed to do this. Right? So allow free competition, right? Allow people to actually enter and start producing their own currency. They may or may not succeed, and let them, right, succeed or not, as the case may be. Right? A fourth point, which Sennholz would point out, is this: it's amazing to me, right, when you say something like, oh, I want a market-based money, people act like you're being totally radical, right? But a lot of these steps that we're talking about to get to currency competition are extremely small, right? They don't necessarily require changes in behavior by anyone other than the government that's enforcing this legislation, right? Okay, so the last one then would be honesty in minting, right? We know the Treasury, right, it mints a lot of coins, and if you have, say, a silver dollar, right, so it's by the ounce of pure silver, roughly pure, like 0.999 pure or something like that, ounce of silver, it has stamped on it, right, $1. Right, which is its legal tender value. Now, the silver inside of that coin is worth substantially more than $1. Right? But if I go to the grocery store and I try to use, right, the silver coin to buy my groceries, they're going to say, well, it has $1 stamped on it. Pick the pack of gum you want. Right? And so it would be crazy, right, for me to try to use, right, these Treasury stamped coins, right, in exchange the way that it is now. So what Sennholz suggests is that we do something very simple, and that is stop putting dollar values on these coins. Right? It's an ounce. 0.999% pure, or 0.999 pure, and then it can trade, right, at whatever the ratio happens to be. So it might be worth roughly, I think at the moment it's something in the neighborhood of $15, $20, right, in exchange if I can convince somebody that a silver coin is what they want to take instead of paper dollars. Right? Okay. So that's it. 4 very simple things, right? Allow people to use whatever currency they like, right? Free entry in currency, which would require legal change, right? Eliminate legal tender laws, also a legal change, but these are not outrageous things that require people to change their behavior, right? And honest minting by weight, it's actually simplifying what the Treasury is doing in terms of its minting process. That's it. Right? That's all it would really take to get currency competition started. Then, let the market decide, right? So, back to the first Misesian point, let's positively affirm whatever the market chooses. It might be that the paper dollar can hang on for a while, right? It's been reasonably well managed compared to many currencies. It might be that it loses out to something like Bitcoin. It might be that it loses out to something like gold or silver. Like, I don't know, I'm an awful entrepreneur. I hope that you don't have to be a good entrepreneur to be a good economist, or I'm in trouble, right? I'm an awful entrepreneur. I don't know what the market's going to do, right? But I say, let it do it. Okay, that's the key. Okay, so how would the system then work if we have these private producers of money? Dr. Klein did talk about this a little bit in her talk, but I think it bears repeating. Right, so let's say that we move to something like a gold-based system. Now, I would note, if we do have a gold-based system, that doesn't mean that there's a single producer of gold that might make mistakes the way the Fed might in our current system. Right? It is possible if we have, say, a gold-based money, there could be lots of miners of gold, because there are currently lots of miners of gold, and there's no necessary reason that would change. There might be lots of minters of gold, because right now there are lots of minters of gold, and there's no necessary reason that would change. Right? So that means then, right, mistakes, right, are less serious. Right. So let's suppose that we do have these entrepreneurs, right, trying to make decisions about how much gold they want to mine, right, and mint and so on to bring into monetary uses. How do you make the choice? Right? So on the basis of like any other business, like shoes, profit and loss. Now, when you're dealing with money, things are kind of funny. Right? And an ounce of gold is an ounce of gold. If this is being used as money, that hasn't changed. What does change is your cost of production. Right? So if gold is becoming more valuable, people want more of it. Right? Okay, then that means it takes less gold for me to pay my workers, right, for me to pay for electricity, for me to pay the various costs involved. Right? Okay, so now it's more profitable, right, for me to produce more gold. So it makes sense. I'm going to ramp up production. Perhaps there'll be new entrants, right, coming in, starting to mine gold that didn't think about doing it before, right, but now it's more profitable to do it. Right? So they start producing more gold. Right? So let's put this together. Right? So suppose there's an increase in the demand for this gold money. Right? In that case, it gains value. Because of that, it's now more profitable for us to produce gold when people produce more of it. This is the way we want the economy to work. Right? When people want more of the thing, we produce more of it. Right? And it could go the other way around. Right? It very well might be, maybe people say, well, I don't actually want more gold. I'm okay as it is. Right? In which case, demand falls. Right? The value of gold would fall as a result. Right? Which means then I have to pay my workers more to convince them to actually work. I have to pay more for electricity and so on. I'm taking losses. So we start cutting back production. Which is exactly what we want the economy to do. Right? If people want less of the thing, we produce less of the thing. Right? So that's exactly the way we would like this to work. Okay. Now, I would note, I just want to say a very quick comment about Bitcoin here. One of the criticisms of Bitcoin that I've heard from Dr. Herbner, and I think he's basically right, is that that doesn't operate the way we just described, right? If you want to know how many Bitcoins are going to exist at any point in time, we know that now. It's actually closer to a Friedman rule, but not a constant percentage each year. It's totally predictable, what the quantity of Bitcoin is going to be every single year or day, even for that matter. And so it doesn't respond in quite the same way. Now, does that mean that people won't pick it? I don't know, I'm a terrible entrepreneur, okay? But I suspect that if Bitcoin had to actually fight a fair fight with something like a more commodity-backed money, that it probably wouldn't win. Might it win against paper dollars? Time may tell. Right, so I just want to finish up then with a quote. I mentioned Senholz's Money and Freedom, which I do really enjoy, and I think this quote just sums it up very well. That is that sound money and free banking are not impossible. They're merely illegal. This is why money must be deregulated. In freedom, the money and banking industry can create sound and honest currencies, just as other free industries can produce efficient and reliable products. Freedom of money and freedom of banking. These are the principles that must guide our steps. Thank you. I'll see you at dinner.